Day 0. As much as I hate having to type this out, I've come to terms with my wife's insistence. When I first told her about my upcoming assignment in the Arctic, she flat out refused to let me go. Over time, she reluctantly agreed, but of course, under one condition. She wants me to keep a journal while I'm out there. Her logic is that if I'm going to be stuck with a bunch of guys in an isolated outpost for a month, what she calls a total sausage fest, I should have some way of sharing my thoughts and feelings. Apparently, she's convinced none of my coworkers will be open to personal discussion and that bottling things up will eventually drive me insane. I've always been fine being alone for weeks at a time. Solitude doesn't bother me one bit, but there's no convincing her of that. Any resistance on my part at this point would be pointless. I apologize for going on, but this is just who I am. If I start rambling off on some tangent, I'll try to catch myself before I end up writing pages of irrelevant noun sets. Wait, why am I even writing this as if someone is going to read it? I hope nobody ever reads this trash. I'm only keeping my promise to my wife so she can stay happy. If someone does read it, well, enjoy the ramblings of a man who sometimes overthinks too much. So, I'm writing this journal while on my Arctic assignment. Actually, let's call it an expedition. It sounds more thrilling that way. The expedition was organized by the company I work for, Hornbeck Offshore. We specialize in ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, primarily used in the oil field to service rigs, vessels, and whatever else clients hire us for. Recently, though, we were rented out by a division of the federal government for observation under the Arctic ice. I can't remember exactly which agency. It's a detail I missed because I had dozed off during the briefing. But apparently, I'm required to go along because I'm one of the most experienced machinists in the group. I'll have my own shop adjacent to the main building. I have no idea how much that cost them to set up, and honestly, I don't care. The government is footing the bill. There's a knock at my door now. That must mean it's time to catch our shuttle to the airport. The flight is going to be roughly 19 hours long, and I fully intend to bring a bottle of NyQuil. I can hardly stand most of the people in the office. I can only imagine what a delight it will be to spend nearly 20 hours with them in a cramped airplane cabin. I take one last look out the window of my shop. The office is empty, everyone else already gone, leaving me to kill time on my computer. I better remember to turn off all the lights so my boss doesn't get upset about the electric bill. I'll try to update this journal every few days, though I make no promises. On the bright side, one of our coworkers brought an external hard drive full of movies, so maybe this expedition won't be as miserable as I first anticipated. Day 2. As much as I'd hoped, I slept through almost the entire flight yesterday. I took some NyQuil as soon as we took off and quickly drifted off. Before I fell asleep, someone took the vacant seat next to me. I was tempted to ask him to move, but decided against it. Pissing this guy off would be a very bad idea, especially since we'll be stuck in the same building for the next month. I remember him shaking my hand and introducing himself, but his name completely escaped me. By that point, I was half asleep and barely paying attention. After that, he stayed silent, keeping his seat next to me. I rested my head against the window as pressure built in my ears, and before I knew it, I was out cold, floating somewhere between dream and reality.
When I finally woke up, I let out a long, drawn-out yawn and popped the pressure that had built up in my ears during the flight. I had forgotten to take the decongestant my wife had packed for me, but the discomfort wasn't nearly as bad as what had happened while I slept. Apparently, one of the computer techs had had a little too much to drink before the flight and ended up vomiting all over the airplane bathroom. Flight attendants had cleaned it up, but it took both of them working together to get the place back in order. As I got up from my seat to use the restroom, I passed the drunk man. He had been strapped back into his seat, the belt pulled tight across his chest. I assume either the flight attendants or some of my coworkers had done it. Whoever it was, I silently thanked them. I also prayed to whatever higher power might be listening that he wouldn't continue this behavior once we arrived at the base camp. The remainder of the flight, roughly an hour, passed uneventfully. I stayed awake, catching up on the news on my laptop. Thankfully, my company hadn't skimped on comfort and booked a plane equipped with Wi-Fi. The base was supposed to have internet only intermittently, and from what I remembered my boss saying, the signal was notorious for cutting out at the worst possible times. That didn't bother me too much, though. The plane touched down with a jolt, more roughly than I would have preferred. Honestly, the Jeep I drove to work in back home was worse. Stretching, I grabbed my bag from under the seat in front of me and followed my coworkers outside. The first thing that hit me was the wind. It struck like a physical force, and I instinctively clutched the brim of my hat. As I made my way down the stairs, I squinted, forcing my eyes into narrow slits to avoid the sting of snow and ice in the air. Once my boots finally hit solid ground, or what I assumed was solid ice, I set my bag down and shielded my eyes with my hand. All I could see was white. Nothing but white. I don't know why I had expected anything else. Perhaps I had imagined rolling plains or grassy hills beneath a sunlit sky. Instead, I was greeted by a barren, endless landscape of snow and ice stretching as far as the eye could see. A small, single-story building sat a short distance away. Next to it, a radar dish mounted on a rusted steel frame barely taller than the roof. I couldn't help but feel sorry for anyone assigned to live and work there. "All right, everyone, I need you to form groups of 3 for the ride over to the base camp," my boss barked, clipboard in hand. He stood rigidly in front of us, eyes scanning the group like a drill sergeant. No one moved immediately. Everyone stood silently, pulling their parkas tighter against the biting wind. "Don't just stand there. I didn't get an extra 30% of my salary to freeze my ass off while you guys act like penguins. Move!" He roared the last word, prompting everyone to scramble into groups of 3. By the time I picked up my bag, there was only one group left with just 2 people. I walked over and recognized one of the people, the man who had sat next to me on the plane. As I approached, he glanced back and made eye contact with me, his expression unusually cheerful for someone in this miserable climate. "Hey man, it's you! Did you get enough sleep?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of unnatural enthusiasm. "Yeah, plenty. I'll need it for the long day ahead." He nodded and smiled knowingly. "You looked like you were out cold. I had to switch seats because you kept leaning over on me." I scratched the back of my neck, trying to hide my embarrassment. "Yeah, sorry about that. I don't really stay still when I sleep." "What did you say your name was again?" The man flipped down his sunglasses to shield his eyes from the harsh glare reflecting off the snow. "Ethan McAllister," I said, extending my gloved hand. Our fingers barely managed to meet through the thick gloves. "Drake Mason," he replied, shaking my hand firmly. "Now that I think about it, I've seen you around the shop a few times. You're one of the machinists, right?" I smiled faintly, not really knowing what else to say, but thankful the conversation was friendly. For a moment, the harsh cold and endless white expanse outside felt a little less intimidating.
All right, everyone, grab your gear and pile into the vehicles. We've got a few more hours until we reach the base camp, so get comfortable, my boss called. Our respective groups trudged toward the line of snow vehicles parked nearby. They were painted a bright orange at one point, though the constant sun and ice had faded them to a dull, weathered hue. Rust had eaten away at the lettering along the side, leaving brown patches around the stamped SM100S logo. We climbed into the crawlers, the engines rumbling to life with clouds of exhaust smoke curling into the freezing air. I sat in the back with Drake, while an unfamiliar face occupied the seat up front next to the driver. As the vehicle lurched forward, I glanced out the window at the small one-story building we'd left behind. A figure stood in the doorway. I couldn't explain why, but The person seemed impossibly tall, bent awkwardly to fit inside the frame. My first instinct wasn't fear exactly. It was unease, a prickling sensation that crawled down my spine. The figure didn't move abruptly, didn't wave or gesture, but it maintained its gaze on our departing convoy. After a few moments, it shuffled back inside, eyes still following us, never breaking contact. I nudged Drake subtly, hoping he had noticed too, but he remained absorbed in a small book he had opened on his lap. Deciding it wasn't worth mentioning, I let it drop. No need to startle him with something so minor, especially when I barely knew him. The last thing I wanted was for him to think I was some paranoid lunatic on day one. The ride to the base was uneventful, aside from the driver trying to start up conversations every few minutes. I wasn't much of a talker, and socializing was the last thing I wanted to do. I just stared out the window, letting the snowy landscape blur past in silence, conserving whatever energy I still had. By the time we arrived, exhaustion hit me like a wall. Maybe it was the lingering jet lag, or maybe the cold and monotony were already wearing me down. Even though I'd slept plenty on the flight, my body felt sluggish, as if it had been drained by the Arctic air. The vehicles ground to a halt, and we climbed out into the biting cold once again. The sun had mostly set, leaving the camp bathed in the harsh glow of floodlights. As my boss barked instructions to the group, I nodded along, barely paying attention. My stomach rumbled with hunger, and Drake prodded me in the side to keep me awake. I imagined myself back in my bunk, cocooned in blankets, letting sleep swallow me whole. When my boss mentioned taking the day off tomorrow to rest and recover, I perked up slightly. That sounded like heaven. I was among the first through the door. While everyone else wandered around the base in curious awe, I scanned a bulletin board mounted on the wall. My room number caught my eye, and I made my way toward it. Inside, I shut the door, dropped my gear onto the floor, and collapsed onto the bed. I didn't even take off my boots or parka. I simply surrendered to sleep, letting my body go completely limp. I woke up the next morning to discover that Drake had been assigned as my roommate for the duration of the stay. Honestly, I wasn't complaining. I counted myself lucky I didn't have the drunk from the plane or the loudmouth from the design office as my companion. Later, I wandered into the main area of the base, which my boss casually calls the den. The name seemed fitting. A cluster of couches faced a large television, and the room contained a pool table, a pinball machine, and a few other recreational items I doubted I'd ever use. Still, it was nice to have a space to stretch out, relax, and prepare mentally for the month ahead.
I joined two other men in the kitchen, which overlooked the den. They had already cooked breakfast and were sitting at one end of the table. They offered me the remaining fried egg and bacon strips, which I gladly accepted. Before taking my seat, I scooped some coffee grounds into the machine and turned it on, savoring the small ritual. Breakfast turned out better than I had expected. The two men introduced themselves as Roger and David, and I found them genuinely enjoyable to talk to. Roger was a large, muscular man with dirty blonde hair, spiked high with enough product to hold a small animal. His voice was booming, commanding attention, but surprisingly warm in conversation. David, on the other hand, was thin with long black hair neatly combed back. He spoke softly, almost hesitantly at first, but his eyes lit up whenever the topic turned to books. We ended up talking about favorite authors and novels for hours. Time flew by so quickly that when we looked up, it was around 2 p.m. and everyone else was starting to stir. We exchanged goodbyes, promising to continue the conversation the next day. Even though I've never been a big fan of long social interactions, I genuinely enjoyed their company. I could already tell this trip might not be as miserable as I had feared, provided I could push past my usual reluctance to be social. Now, I'm back in my room typing this entry. Drake is sitting nearby, watching videos on his laptop whenever the sluggish Wi-Fi decides to cooperate. I'd better wrap this up. The boss just announced over the intercom that dinner is ready. Oh, one more thing. I have a minor complaint. I forgot until now that I woke up last night to a shout. Apparently, Drake screams in his sleep. I ignored it and buried my head deep into my pillow, hoping it was a one-time occurrence. I'm hundreds of miles away from earplugs, so here's to hoping for quieter nights. Day 3. Today marked the first day we actually did some real work. I shouldn't exactly be celebrating that, but at least it gave the day a purpose. Drake, myself, and 4 other team members boarded a pair of snow crawlers and headed out to our project site. The ride lasted about 45 minutes, considerably shorter than our trip from the plane to the base. A team had arrived here a few weeks earlier and set up a temporary building near a large hole in the ice. The portable shelter was nothing glamorous, but it had a heater, and that was all I really cared about. After a quick tour of the facility, we got to work. My job was to monitor the gauges on one of the screens. If the pressure in any of the ROV's pneumatic arms fluctuated or a part broke, it would be my responsibility to go out and swap the damaged piece with a spare. Everything had a backup, so I was never without a solution. Luckily, nothing malfunctioned today, so I mostly spent the time talking with Drake. Occasionally, he had to resolve a software issue with the computers, but it was never anything too demanding. Overall, the day went by at a steady pace, and I found it satisfying to have productive work to focus on. By the time we were ready to return to base, I was famished. One of the team members had forgotten to bring our lunch, which did nothing for my mood. The drive back felt longer than it should have been, my stomach growling loudly with every bump in the icy terrain. As we approached the base, the floodlights flicked on, casting the camp in a harsh glow. The sun, which had been fading during our work at the expedition site, had nearly vanished completely, leaving the camp bathed in cold, artificial light.
As soon as the snow crawler ground to a halt, I flung open the door and practically bolted inside. Rounding a corner, I sprinted through the den and made a beeline for the kitchen. I yanked open the fridge and grabbed the pre-made sandwich I had stashed away, the one our forgetful teammate had failed to pack for me. Too consumed by hunger to bother with etiquette, I tossed the crumpled plastic wrap onto the floor and ripped it off with one hand, devouring the sandwich in a few frantic bites. Even after finishing it, my stomach was still growling, demanding more. I wandered back into the den, joining the rest of the crew while our cook prepared dinner. A Seinfeld episode played on the television, drawing my attention, but my nose kept drifting toward the aroma of cooking meat. Soon everyone gathered at the long table in the kitchen, and we dug into a hearty meal. I sat with Drake, Roger, David, and a couple of other people I recognized from the expedition. Between bites of tender pork roast, we talked about our lives back home, sharing stories, small frustrations, and a few laughs. I couldn't believe I was saying this, but I was actually enjoying socializing. Maybe my wife was right after all. Maybe this log isn't strictly necessary. Then again, I realized these entries gave me a rare pocket of quiet to process the day, so I'd keep writing. Perhaps someday I'd enjoy looking back at these ramblings. After dinner, we all reconvened in the den to watch a movie. The boss had decided that after our first day of actual work, we deserved a small celebration. One of the employees, the guy who brought the external hard drive full of movies, connected it to his laptop and then to the television. After scrolling through the list for a while, he selected a film I remember seeing in theaters as a kid, John Carpenter's The Thing. For those unfamiliar, The Thing is about an Arctic research team that encounters a shape-shifting alien capable of taking the form of any human. The result is paranoia, tension, and the chilling inability to distinguish man from monster. Halfway through the movie, I excused myself to grab a beer. No one seemed to notice my absence. Everyone was glued to the screen as a sled dog began to twist and transform into some grotesque, unnatural form. I opened the fridge and pulled out a strawberry ale, thinking it would pair nicely with the tension on screen.
As I turned back toward the den, I caught sight of Drake standing by the window, staring out into the night. He was completely still, completely focused, his eyes locked on some point outside. I walked past him silently, beer in hand, and returned to the couch. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed his gaze. Nothing. Just snow, drifting down in the pale glow of the floodlights. Shrugging, I sipped my beer and turned my attention back to the movie. The suspense, the claustrophobia, and the grotesque transformations kept me hooked, at least until fatigue got the better of me. I dozed off sometime around the last half hour, missing the climax entirely. I woke to Drake gently shaking me and calling my name. Blinking away the drowsiness, I followed him back to our room. I crawled into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I'm one of those people who, once woken, can't drift off again until the early hours of the morning. Resigned, I decided to make use of the time. Drake, sitting at the small desk in our room, was muttering under his breath at his laptop, cursing the unreliable Wi-Fi. He had been attempting to send the same email to his wife and kids for nearly an hour. Meanwhile, I opened my laptop and began typing these words, using the quiet time to collect my thoughts. Finally, my body's exhaustion caught up with me. My eyelids grew heavy, and I realized it was time to surrender to sleep. The clock read 2 in the morning, leaving only 6 hours before we had to rise again for another day at the expedition site. I nestled under my blankets, the Arctic chill far outside our insulated room, and let myself drift off, hoping that tomorrow would bring less fatigue and more manageable work. I would need every bit of rest I could get if I was going to survive, and maybe even enjoy another day in this frozen, isolated world.
Yesterday was a rough one for me. I woke up with only about 6 hours of sleep under my belt, which made the entire workday a groggy blur. Drake, ever the helpful companion, tried his best to keep me awake, chatting as much as he could. I gave him kudos for the effort. Seriously, he deserves some kind of medal. If only I could have matched even half of his energy just to keep my head from nodding off onto the table, I might have been less of a liability. Toward the end of the day, the ROV needed to be pulled back to the surface. One of the flotation blocks had come loose, and the vehicle had to be retrieved via its tether. Apparently, the pilot had tried to explore a small cavern structure beneath the ice and scraped the block clean off. By the time I had removed the bolts from the frame that once held the block, it was too late to replace it and continue working. The team informed me that if we had attempted to send the ROV back to the same spot, it would have only had 5 minutes to operate before we'd have to reel it in again. The thought of a short workday lifted my spirits, though I kept my excitement hidden. No reason for my boss to rethink the schedule based on my obvious delight. We all piled into the snow crawlers and made our way back to base roughly an hour early. After dinner, I spent some time playing video games with Roger and David before turning in for the night. Today, instead of heading out to the expedition site, I stayed in my shop to fabricate a new flotation block using the stock we'd brought along. I had never set foot in this particular workshop, but I expected it to resemble a smaller version of my shop back home. On opening the door, I was greeted with neatly arranged machines lining the walls. Though only about a quarter of the size of my primary shop, it had half as many tools crammed into the space. It was a bit more cramped than I preferred, but I wasn't going to complain. I spent the day machining a solid block of condensed foam according to a set of plans laid out on a nearby table. The government had apparently given my company enough funds to splurge a little. There was even a Bluetooth speaker set up for me to use. Pink Floyd, King Crimson, Rush, and other classic rock and prog tracks played in the background while I worked. It was a strange kind of bliss. Cold outside, but music and machinery made the day pass quickly. When it was time for lunch, I joined David and Roger at the kitchen table. Their job was to take all the data the ROV gathered and turn it into maps, spreadsheets, and other organized collections.
They tried to explain the work to me as we ate, but most of what they said sounded like gibberish. Roger spoke about mapping the ocean floor, while David, a marine biologist, added explanations that somehow made even less sense. I nodded politely, chewing my sandwich, pretending to understand. After lunch, I returned to the shop to finish the flotation block. Another hour of careful work and attention to detail later, the task was complete. I checked my watch, only 4 in the afternoon. Drake and the rest of the team weren't due back for another hour, so I used the time to gather the block and other supplies I would need for tomorrow's work. I switched off the lights, zipped up my parka, and prepared myself for the short trek back to the main base camp. Stepping out into the cold, I trudged through the snow that had fallen overnight. My eyes wandered toward the mountain range looming over our camp, jagged and imposing against the gray sky. Some team members had wanted to take a helicopter up there and ski down, but the boss had the kibosh on that idea. His reasoning? Our insurance doesn't cover you being a bunch of dumbasses. He had never been the most pleasant person back home, and the cold seemed only to amplify his irritability. That was all the reason I needed to keep my distance and stay out of his way. The walk back to base was quiet, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound. Even in a place this barren, the mountains reminded me of just how small and exposed we really were. It was a sobering thought, but also strangely grounding. Tomorrow promised more work, more ROV missions, and hopefully fewer surprises. I only hoped I could keep my energy up long enough to handle it all.
Suddenly, something on one of the mountains caught my attention. At first, I assumed my eyes were playing tricks on me. Fatigue and monotony conspiring to create some mirage. I rubbed the side of my face with the hand not holding the flotation block, blinking rapidly to clear my vision. When I looked again, it hadn't gone away. It was a tall, slender, black shape. That's all I could make out. Roughly estimating its height, I figured it must have been at least 10 feet tall. Completely still. Not a single shift or movement. I don't know why, even now, it doesn't feel like anything I've ever seen before. I've spent my life around strange machinery, odd terrains, and even a few adrenaline-pumping scenarios, but this was different. Oddly, I wasn't scared in the conventional sense. No screaming, no immediate panic. It wasn't like seeing some ghastly creature from a campfire story or a cryptid in the woods. Instead, it produced this weight, a heavy, all-encompassing dread that settled in my chest and seeped into my limbs. Even now, writing this, I feel the faint pull of that exhaustion, the mental fatigue lingering from that fleeting moment. I wish I could articulate it better. Words fail me, but I know one thing. I've never experienced fear like this. Not in all my years of work, travel, or isolated excursions. Drake is asleep now, curled beneath the blankets in the other bed, unaware of the storm swirling in my head. I've locked the door, drawn the curtains tightly over the windows, and tried to convince myself that it was nothing alive, just some jagged shadow. Maybe a weird rock formation or a man-made structure. Every logical part of my brain tells me this, yet the irrational corner refuses to relent. I keep turning it over, examining every possible explanation, every alternate reason. Sleep-deprived paranoia isn't going to solve this. I need rest. I need to think this through properly with a fresh mind. Day 9. After forcing myself to sleep and waking up this morning, I've resolved to treat what I saw as nothing more than a figment of my imagination. My wife had warned me that being isolated like this could make a man lose his grip on reality. I know I'm not insane, or at least I'm not there yet. The shape on the mountainside? A trick of light, snow, and fatigue. Nothing more, nothing less.
Since that day, I've deliberately pushed the memory to the back of my mind. I haven't brought it up with Drake, Roger, or David. There's no point in worrying them with what might be nothing more than a hallucination or overactive imagination. The past few days have been uneventful, though monotonous. Drake and I head out to the expedition site, sit in the temporary shelter, and monitor the ROV while it carries out its assigned tasks. So far, the only repair I've had to perform was replacing a flotation block. Small victories, I suppose, but the monotony of sitting in that shelter all day makes it hard to stay focused. Drake does his best to keep me engaged, joking and chatting, but I can't help wishing we were back at base, lounging in the den with the television playing. Yesterday, Roger and David had the TV going all day while they worked, and I couldn't help feeling a twinge of envy. At least they had some distraction from the endless white expanse outside. Meanwhile, my entertainment consists of the frost and ice patterns forming on the windows. Beautiful, yes, but not exactly captivating after hour 7. I even considered briefly the absurd idea of purposefully damaging some minor component on the ROV just to spend time in the shop with music playing. It was ridiculous, of course, but desperation breeds strange thoughts.
Yet, I seem to have digressed. I didn't start this entry to detail the past few days of boredom. Something happened last night that I can't simply ignore. No one got hurt, nothing catastrophic occurred. But what Drake told me, well, it rattled me more than I expected. He wasn't joking. He wasn't acting like some trope from a horror movie. He didn't hint at violence, rebellion, or chaos. He just unsettled me. After dinner, Drake excused himself from the group and returned to our room. I stayed behind in the den, nursing a beer and watching the fog. By the time I left, it was around midnight. I opened the door to our room and froze. Drake was at the window again, just like the night I had seen that shape. But this time, he wasn't just standing there. His face was pressed against the glass. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I wanted to get closer. Something about his posture radiated unease. Still, curiosity and concern drove me forward. "Drake, are you all right?" I said, cautiously. He startled visibly. His hands flew to his mouth as if to stifle a scream. His eyes were wide, filled with something I can only describe as raw fear. The hands covering his mouth trembled uncontrollably. "Seriously, man," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "If there's something wrong, you can tell me. Normally, I don't push people to open up about their problems, but this felt different. I couldn't let my roommate stew in terror for the rest of our stay." Slowly, he lowered his hands. His shaking intensified, and his gaze wavered between me and the window. You've seen it, too, haven't you?" he stammered, every word choked with tension. All I could do at first was stare, mouth agape. I let out a long, confused sigh before finding my voice. "What in God's name were you talking about? There's nothing out there but snow and ice." Drake shook his head violently, his eyes snapping back to the window. His body trembled as he returned his gaze to me. "I know you've seen it. I can tell you have." By now, my patience was fraying. Concern was there, yes, but frustration was creeping in. I glanced down the hall, checking if anyone might be listening. The hallway was empty, the den silent. Satisfied, I closed the door and locked it. "All right, Drake," I said, my voice flat, tinged with irritation. "We're going to get this straight right now. You need to tell me what you mean. What is it?" He drew a deep breath, swallowing hard as if the words themselves were poison. "The shape," he whispered. "I've seen it. You've seen it too." The memory hit me like a freight train. That tall, impossible black figure on the mountainside. The weight of dread. The sensation of having the cold press down on every nerve. I felt it again, seeping back into me, like a shadow reaching across the room. How
How the hell do you know that I saw it? I asked, voice low. I haven't talked to anyone about this, not a soul. Drake's eyes were wide and unblinking, his face pale in the dim light. I just know, he said. I can feel it in you, the way you look at the mountains, the way you froze. I felt it too. You felt it the same way I did. My chest tightened. My mind raced, and all the logical explanations I'd clung to over the past few days began to crumble. A man-made structure? A trick of the light? None of it accounted for the visceral, instinctual dread that radiated from that thing. And now Drake had confirmed it wasn't just me. I swallowed hard, trying to regain composure. Okay, I said, my words deliberate. If you're telling the truth, then we need to figure out what it is. But we're not panicking, not yet. First, we need to observe, take note, understand it before letting fear rule us. Drake nodded, trembling but relieved to have someone to confide in. For the first time in days, the isolation didn't feel quite so crushing. We were no longer alone in this. There was something out there, but at least now we would face it together. And even as I write this, that same cold dread coils in my stomach. That thing, that shape, is real. I've felt it. Drake has felt it. And now, we can't unsee it.
Drake hadn't broken his gaze with me once during our conversation. His eyes were cold, almost glassy, as if reflecting some unseen horror. There was no warmth, no subtle humor, no hint of camaraderie, just pure, frozen focus. Because you're acting just like my grandfather did when he saw it, he said quietly. I blinked, my mind struggling to catch up. Wait, what? I exhaled, letting out a slow, exaggerated breath as I pulled a chair up next to his bed. Well, I added, settling into the seat, I guess we're going to be here a while. I motioned for him to continue. You act like my grandpa when he saw it, Drake began, his voice steady but low. It's called the shape. I know a name like that doesn't sound terrifying at first, but nothing I've ever seen scared a grown man the way this thing did. I leaned back slightly, giving him space to speak, and gestured for him to go on. When I was growing up, my grandfather lived with us. Even though his mind was sharp as a tack, his body had begun to fail him. My mother thought sending him to a retirement home would take away his dignity, so she converted an old guest room and let him move in. He sold his house and used the money to renovate the room himself. Anything left over, he set aside from my college fund. He was meticulous. Everything had its place. Everything had purpose. Drake paused for a moment, then continued. One day, I finally asked him what was wrong. He led me to his room quietly, locked the door behind us, and pressed his ear to it. My parents were just outside, so he needed to make sure we weren't overheard. He placed me on his bed, pulled up a chair, and looked me straight in the eyes, stone cold like I'd never seen before. He made me swear never to tell my parents what he was about to say. He was afraid they'd lock him away, think he'd lost his mind. I promised. And then he started to tell me about it.
Drake's voice dropped lower, filled with a mix of reverence and dread. When my grandfather was in his 20s, he was drafted into World War II. He wasn't sent into the thick of the fighting, but he was close enough to see the horrors. The area where he was stationed, I can't remember the name, but he told me it snowed at least 6 feet in the dead of winter. The nights were brutal. 2 blankets sometimes weren't enough to keep warm. One night it got so cold he bundled up and ran outside to fetch extra blankets from the supply tent. Snow crunched under his boots and the wind bit at his face, but he barely noticed. He just wanted warmth. That's when he saw it. Drake's voice grew heavier. At the edge of the field, where the moonlight barely touched the ground, he saw a figure. Tall, impossibly black, motionless at first. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, an illusion, but then it started moving, slowly, deliberately, toward him. He froze for a moment, paralyzed with fear, and then he ran. He sprinted to the supply tent, threw open the door, slammed it shut, and locked it behind him. His face was pale, breath ragged. The officer inside stared at him, confused, and asked what the hell he was doing out in the cold. Grandpa pointed at the window. Drake's voice grew quieter, almost reverent. The officer walked to the window, expecting the field to be empty, but it wasn't. The shape had moved closer, so close that a spotlight could have caught it. Grandpa barely had time to react. He grabbed the radio and called for the lights. Within minutes, the commanding officer and a group of soldiers had barged in, yelling and shouting, trying to understand what was happening. But nothing explained it. By morning, 3 soldiers were missing. No trace, no word, and a mysterious group of jeeps had appeared, swarming the area. They had no markings, no identification. They were there for 4 days, and then gone. Nothing more was ever said, and my grandfather never found out what became of the missing soldiers or the strange search party. I shifted in my chair, feeling the cold dread from Drake's story seep into me. I could see why he had said the fear in my eyes reminded him of his grandfather. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, a primal awareness that some unknown force could be watching, waiting. Drake swallowed hard. When my grandfather came home, he told my grandmother what he saw out in the field that night. She thought he was exaggerating or maybe imagining things, but he never lied about something like this. He spoke about it with a solemnity I'd never seen before. That thing, that shape, it left a mark on him, on the man he was. It shaped the way he lived, the decisions he made, even how he treated those around him. He never fully got over it. I felt a chill run down my spine. Even with the warmth of the room, the frost creeping in from the window, and the hum of the base's heating system, I felt cold. My mind wandered back to the mountains outside, to the tall, black figure I'd glimpsed in the snow. Everything Drake said made my sighting feel less like a trick of the light and more like inevitability. I don't know why I'm telling you all this now, except that I think you're seeing it too. And now that you have, you'll understand what my grandfather went through. That creeping awareness, the moments of absolute dread. It's real. It's out there. And I think it's been waiting for someone to notice it again. I tried to respond, but words failed me. All I could do was stare, imagining the black silhouette looming over the snowfield, silent and still, unyielding. The stories of my grandfather's wartime encounter and Drake's fearful certainty weighed on me. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, a coincidence, maybe even a shared hallucination. But my instinct said otherwise. Something ancient and colder than we were was out there, moving just at the edge of perception. Drake leaned back, eyes still fixed on the wall opposite mine, hands folded tightly in his lap. "I can't explain everything," he said finally. "All I know is that we're not alone in seeing it, and now that you've seen it, well, there's no taking it back." I exhaled slowly, trying to absorb the gravity of his words. Part of me wanted to laugh, to shrug it off, pretend it was a trick of the light, but deep down I knew the truth. Something was out there, something older and colder than we were, and now Drake and I were tethered to it, drawn into a story my grandfather had lived through decades before. The weight of realization pressed down on me, like the Arctic snow outside the base.
I felt the same dread my grandfather carried, the same icy awareness Drake had seen in me. Whatever the shape was, it wasn't confined to stories or memory. It was alive, patient, and watching. And now, it knew we had noticed it.
For years, my grandfather lived a relatively normal life. He married, settled down, and enjoyed himself in small, quiet ways. He took a job at a local machine shop when he returned home from the war, and every day he found purpose and satisfaction in the rhythm of his work. Life was predictable, comforting, and safe. Yet, as Drake began recounting this part of the story, I could tell that safety was only an illusion. A fragile veneer stretched thin over something far darker. "It wasn't until 10 years later," Drake said softly, "that the incident resurfaced. My grandfather saw the shape again. It wasn't right at his window, lurking in a corner, or pressed against the wall like some haunting vision from a nightmare. No, it stood in the backyard, distant, patient, observing. Day or night, sun or snow, rain or sleet, it was always there. Always. Every single day for years, the shape simply waited, silently mocking him. He feared it would one day step inside the house, but it never did. It remained a phantom in the shadows, an unrelenting presence that gnawed at his mind." Drake's voice trembled slightly, though he tried to mask it. He tried to find answers, doing research at libraries, poring over whatever obscure materials he could get his hands on. Years of searching, mostly dead ends, until one day he stumbled across a medical journal, a donation from a private collection that had belonged to a long-forgotten mental hospital in Ohio. The journal was filled with notes from a doctor who had cared for a patient named Mark Squire. Mark had seen the shape too. Never inside, never closer than the lawn, but always there. And it had driven him insane. He'd murdered his family, lost in confusion and terror, and the court deemed him unfit to stand trial. He was transferred to a mental hospital, and the doctor documented every day of his decline. Even in the hospital, Mark could still see the shape on the lawn, outside his window, always watching, always waiting. Drake's hands shook slightly as he continued. After a few weeks in care, Mark opened up a little more. The shape, it began to speak to him. He refused to say the words aloud, claiming it would anger it, so he was forced to write them down. The doctor preserved that sheet of paper inside the journal. The writing was faint, yellowed with age, but my grandfather could still make out the message. "All of our mistakes are never forgotten." Drake paused, swallowing hard. Shortly after, the nurses found Mark dead in his cell. He'd bent the metal leg of his bedpost back and forth until it snapped. Using the jagged edge, he cut his throat. The doctor's final note said he died sitting against a wall, facing the window, staring out as if waiting for the shape to leave. Even in death, he couldn't escape it. My stomach churned. I could feel the cold fear that had enveloped Drake's grandfather seeping through the story, infecting the room. "And my grandfather," Drake said quietly, "he never discovered anything else about the shape. He gave up searching, satisfied that he at least knew part of its nature.
But it didn't leave him. It was still there, in the backyard, waiting. One day, he finally worked up the courage to confront it. He stepped out onto the porch, took a deep breath, and shouted at it. "I'm not afraid of you!" At first, the shape didn't move. My grandfather braced himself, expecting it to advance, expecting it to engulf him in that same shadowy dread he'd felt for decades. But then, slowly, deliberately, it turned toward the woods and vanished among the trees. It left, but not forever. It had retreated, patient as always, waiting for the moment it could return. Drake's voice softened, and I leaned forward, drawn in by the gravity of his words. Even after all that, it came back. My grandfather told me it had returned, standing in the backyard. I asked him if it had entered the house, creeping into rooms where it could terrorize him in private. He reassured me that it hadn't. It stayed outside, visible only to those old enough, or perhaps old enough to recognize it. He theorized that I hadn't been ready to see it yet, too young, too naive. Over the years, he constantly reflected on those words Mark had written. All of our mistakes are never forgotten. He came to believe that the shape wasn't just a creature. It was a physical manifestation of our wrongdoings, a force that existed to remind us of our errors, to punish us for them. Since I was still young at the time, he assumed I hadn't committed anything significant enough to summon its attention. Drake stopped, his chest heaving lightly. I could see him blink back tears, the faint glow of the room reflecting off them. His composure, so carefully maintained, was breaking in ways I hadn't seen before. My instinct was to offer comfort, but I simply remained still, letting him have the space he needed. He needed to cry, and I didn't want to interrupt the release of years of fear and tension.
"I've never seen a grown man cry," I admitted silently to myself. "Not like this. Not outside of funerals or great losses." Drake's voice was quieter now, trembling, almost fragile. All these years, my grandfather carried this burden, this fear, and I feel it too now, seeing it, understanding it, and knowing that it could be out there, waiting, watching. He wiped at his cheeks, trying to regain control, but his hands shook as he returned them to his lap. "I wanted to warn you, John. I wanted to make sure you knew. Once you see it, there's no forgetting it. And no matter how far you run or how much time passes, it waits." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing mind. The room felt smaller, colder, though the heaters hummed softly. I could almost picture the dark figure standing still against the backyard snow, patient and merciless, holding grudges older than either of us. The weight of generations, of war, and of Mark Squire's tragic madness pressed down on me through Drake's story. And in that moment, I realized something undeniable. The shape was not just a story, not just a hallucination, not just a trick of the mind. It was real. Drake's tears continued to fall, quietly, steadily, as he whispered, almost to himself, "It's never truly gone. It's always watching, always judging, always waiting." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, absorbing the weight of his words, feeling that cold dread seep into my own bones. And for the first time, I understood the gravity of everything he had told me.
My grandfather passed away a few weeks after our final conversation, Drake began, his voice low and deliberate, heavy with memory. During his last days, he warned me about the shape. He said it had moved closer to the house, positioning itself just outside his back door. When I asked why it approached him but hadn't done the same to Mark at the hospital, he only shrugged. He said it didn't follow a set of rules or patterns, that it acted like human nature itself, unpredictable, arbitrary. My grandfather believed it behaved differently for each person it stalked, appearing and moving according to its own inscrutable reasoning. Drake's eyes filled with quiet sorrow. One night, he came into my room to give me a hug goodnight. His expression was pale, and I could tell he'd accepted what was coming. He told me the shape had positioned itself right outside his bedroom door. He knew his time was up and that there was nowhere left to run. I remember tears welling up in my own eyes as I said goodbye, unable to do anything to stop what was about to happen. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, the blankets pulled tight over my head, trying to shut the world out. Drake's hands trembled slightly as he continued. When morning came, my parents opened my bedroom door and hurried me into the living room. They told me to sit and stay there. My mother ran to my grandfather's room. My father dialed emergency services. He'd suffered a heart attack overnight. To them, it must have seemed sudden, but I knew exactly what had happened. I didn't speak a word about his warning or what he'd said. I just waited silently for the ambulance to arrive. To this day, I haven't told anyone else. You're the first, John. I remained frozen, my mind racing to process the weight of what Drake had just revealed. The room felt colder, heavier, as if the presence of the shape itself were pressing down on us. You're the first person I've ever spoken to about this, Drake whispered, his voice barely audible. I would have kept it to myself, but when I saw you, I recognized the same look in your eyes that my grandfather had when he first encountered it. He told me then, as I tell you now, the shape doesn't follow patterns. It moves unpredictably, without warning. Its presence is arbitrary, yet deliberate. Drake slowly turned back toward the window, his gaze fixed on the snow-capped mountains beyond. He can see it there, high on the mountains, bathed in moonlight. It hasn't moved since I first noticed it, but that could change at any moment. A chill ran down my spine. My hands shook, and I ran a trembling hand through my hair. My rational mind had long since abandoned any thought that the shape was a trick of my imagination. I could feel its presence in my very bones. But why here? I asked, my voice breaking slightly. Why us? Why now? Drake shook his head slowly. I wish I could explain it, John, but I can't. It doesn't work like that. It acts without reasoning. It comes or it waits. It watches and it decides. That's all we can know. We fell silent, letting the weight of his words sink in. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally, but every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to leave this place behind. Day 14. I had hoped I'd never have to witness it move, but this morning confirmed my worst fears. Drake and I awoke and instinctively checked the window as we had every morning since the first sighting. When I asked if it was still there, he said nothing. I called his name again. Still, he didn't answer. I walked over to the window, bracing myself. There it was, unmistakable. The shape had shifted. It hadn't moved drastically, but it had descended almost halfway down the mountain. My body shook violently as I exhaled. I asked Drake how long it would take to reach us, but he merely shook his head. Weeks, days, hours. It's impossible to tell. It acts differently for everyone it chooses to watch.
Despite the fear coiling in my stomach, we tried to maintain composure at the expedition site. We didn't want anyone to notice how tense we'd become, so we whispered only when necessary, keeping our eyes on the ROV's monitors and on each other. Every glance at the window reminded us that the shape's progress was inevitable, unstoppable. I tried to reassure Drake that panicking would not help. A clear mind was our only hope, however fragile. When we returned to base, it hadn't moved any further. A temporary relief passed between us, a fleeting comfort we both knew was fragile. That evening, everyone gathered around the television for another movie night. While the others were absorbed in the screen, Drake and I continually cast nervous glances toward the mountains, anticipating its movement. By the end of the film, the details had faded from our memory entirely. All that remained in our minds was the looming threat outside, a patient predator waiting for the moment it would descend. I reminded myself constantly not to overthink it, to take breaks, to preserve my sanity. Fear could paralyze us, and we had to remain functional. Now I sit in bed, typing these words. Drake fell asleep about an hour ago, though I know his rest is shallow. He admitted this morning, reluctantly, that he hadn't slept well the night before. I suspect this has been happening for more than a single night. The tension, the fear, and the knowledge of what waits beyond the glass have likely robbed him of countless hours of rest. I can feel it too. Even sitting here, I sense the cold dread lingering in the corners of the room. My mind can't escape it. Every creak, every whisper of the wind against the base camp structures feels like a warning. The shape is patient, deliberate, and I know that when it chooses to move again, it will not hesitate. And so I write, keeping my thoughts anchored in words, trying to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that is entirely out of our hands. The shape watches, it waits, it decides, and we, powerless as we are, can only hope that it delays its approach long enough for us to leave this place alive.
I just glanced over and noticed that Drake was clutching a small cross tightly in his hand. I didn't say anything. I've never been the type to judge anyone for their beliefs, politics, or any of that. And while I've never been particularly religious, a small, insistent voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, an occasional prayer wouldn't hurt right now. Day 16. Something happened tonight. Less than an hour ago, I woke up in the middle of the night, needing to use the bathroom. I got up as quietly as I could, careful not to disturb Drake. I unlocked the door to our room and stepped into the hallway, locking it behind me. Our bedroom is at the very end of the hall, which meant a long trek to the community bathroom on the opposite side. I wrapped my blanket tightly around my shoulders and shivered. The heater must have blown another fuse. The hallway was freezing. It had done this before, about a week ago, and I remembered my boss had made Roger go outside to replace it. David had told me later that the whole situation had something to do with Roger hitting my boss's car in the parking lot. I kept out of it, not wanting to make things worse for myself. As I passed Roger and David's room, I noticed the door was open. Roger must have gone out to replace the fuse again. I couldn't help but silently admire the man's dedication. I turned the corner toward the bathroom, and that's when I felt it. A sudden, sharp cold bit at my ankles, forcing a shiver up my spine. My body trembled as I noticed the entrance door standing wide open. Bitter, icy air poured in, flooding the building. "Damn it, Roger," I muttered under my breath. I pulled the blanket tighter and stepped forward. Each step made the cold worse. I passed through the threshold and into the night. Even with my parka and thick blanket, the wind cut through the layers, searing its icy fingers into my skin. I shivered and turned toward the fuse box on the side of the building. It was closed. If the fuse hadn't blown, then he hadn't come outside for that. My mind raced. Why would he be out here otherwise? I called his name, expecting some response, but all I heard was the wind whistling across the empty grounds. I started walking, circling the base, scanning the area. My heart pounded in my chest as I came around to the north side, and then I saw him. Roger was standing in the snow, perfectly still. Relief washed over me, realizing he hadn't wandered off somewhere to freeze to death. I called his name again. Nothing. He remained motionless, the floodlights casting a long, dark shadow across the pristine white snow. "Roger!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "What the hell are you doing? Are you deaf?" I walked toward him and placed a hand on his shoulder, gently shaking him. He didn't react. Not a flicker. Not a blink. My concern shifted to panic. "All right, I've had enough," I shouted, leaning closer to inspect him. He wasn't dead. I could see his breath forming clouds in the icy air. But his eyes were wide, unnervingly so, and his mouth hung in a grotesque, contorted frown. His throat trembled, and I realized he was trying to speak. Only faint squeaks emerged, barely audible over the howling wind. "Roger," I said, my voice trembling now. "What's wrong?" Suddenly, he jerked his head, staring directly into my eyes. His lips moved, forming words with immense effort. It moved. Damn it, it moved!" I shook my head, unable to make sense of what he was saying. The wind whipped around us, drowning out his voice, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Then he lifted a trembling hand, pointing toward the mountains. My stomach sank, and I followed the direction of his finger. That's when I saw it. It had shifted. Not a lot, but enough to be noticeable. The silhouette, tall and impossibly black against the snow, had moved down the slope, almost imperceptibly yet unmistakably. It seemed to glide rather than walk, a shadow carved out of the night itself. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, cold and unyielding, a presence that stole my breath and made my limbs feel heavy.
Roger remained frozen beside me, his hands still pointing, his body rigid. The sight of it filled me with a creeping dread I couldn't shake. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to obey. All I could do was stare, my mind scrambling to comprehend what was happening. The shape, as Drake had described, was no longer a distant threat. It had moved, and the fact that it had acted while we weren't watching made it infinitely more terrifying. It wasn't waiting for us to notice. It wasn't playing a game. It simply moved, deliberate and patient, closing the distance on its own timeline. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but even that felt like a betrayal. The cold wind pried into my lungs as if reminding me how small and fragile we were in the face of it. I looked back at Roger. His eyes were wide, haunted. He whispered again, almost in disbelief. It knows we see it." I nodded mutely, unable to speak. In that instant, the night felt endless. The floodlights illuminated every flake of snow around the shape, revealing its movement like a slow, terrible inevitability. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but the terror rooting us in place was stronger than my desire to run. And so, we stood there, two men frozen in the snow, staring at something no one should ever see, praying it would not move closer tonight. The shape had almost reached the base. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Drake could hear it even in his sleep. No, I thought, frozen in place. How could it have moved that much in just one night? I turned to face Roger, expecting some kind of reaction, but what I saw made my stomach drop. His mouth was no longer hanging open in a grotesque frown from last night. Instead, it curled into a demented, unsettling smile. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but then it grew. Roger began to laugh. It wasn't the laugh I was used to, the kind he used when David told a crude joke or during one of our late-night Seinfeld marathons in the den. This laugh was different. It was guttural, unnatural, and entirely unhinged. It sounded like it had crawled out of some place too dark to name, a sound reserved for the depths of a lunatic's mind. My blood ran cold. "What in God's name is the matter with you, Roger?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my attempt to remain calm. Without warning, he pressed a finger over my lips, silencing me. His eyes glimmered with something I couldn't define. Fear? Madness? A mix of both? I couldn't tell. The sick, warped smile never left his face. "All of our mistakes are never forgotten," he whispered, punctuating the words with a low, terrifying chuckle. I didn't wait for another word. I turned and ran. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to escape. I didn't dare glance back. I only wanted to get away. I bolted through the snow, my boots crunching violently against the icy ground, and crossed the threshold back inside the building. The door slammed shut behind me with a resounding bang, and I didn't care who woke up. I just needed to get back to my room, crawl under my covers, and pretend none of this was happening.
As I climbed into bed, my hands shaking uncontrollably, I grabbed my laptop to type this all down. Drake lay asleep across the room, clutching his cross tightly. There was no point in waking him now. He needed rest. The weight of what I had just seen pressed heavily on my chest, making it hard to breathe, and I needed to process it before the morning light. Day 17. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over the mountain. I woke to find Drake sitting at his laptop, absorbed in his emails. The normalcy of the scene clashed violently with the terror of last night. Before I even considered grabbing my supplies for a shower, I told him everything I had witnessed. The smile, the laughter, the words. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply sat, silent, digesting my words. I wasn't sure what I expected from him. Shock? Fear? Disbelief? But this was far stranger. He just stared at the floor for a long, tense minute. I felt a cold prickle run down my spine as he finally lifted his gaze to meet mine. "So," he said quietly, his voice measured, "the shape is after someone else, too. I guess we're not alone in this anymore. Just make sure you keep an eye on him. God only knows what a man like him is capable of." With that, he stood and left the room without another word. I was left staring after him, confused and unnerved, trying to understand what he meant. I decided it would be best to speak with him later, out at the expedition site, where we could have some privacy. I made my way to breakfast in the den, hoping to steady my nerves. Roger and David were seated at the table, working on their laptops and eating. Both looked up and offered a casual smile and wave, and I returned it with a forced grin, trying desperately to appear normal. My mind, however, was racing. Roger, who had been the source of such unspeakable terror only hours ago, was now calm, functioning,
and casually eating cereal as if nothing had happened. The contrast between last night and this morning was jarring. I had expected him to lock himself in his room, perhaps wallow in some private madness, but he was fully composed, normal, or as normal as he had ever seemed.
I wanted to confront him immediately, but now wasn't the time. I would wait for a moment when we were alone, when no one else could see or hear us. I finished my breakfast quietly, engaging in light conversation with the two of them, though my heart wasn't in it. When I rinsed my bowl and left it in the sink, I noticed David had retreated to grab supplies. Perfect. I thought this would be my chance to speak with Roger alone. Just as I pulled back a chair to sit and start the conversation, our boss called out that it was time for the expedition team to depart. I cursed quietly under my breath and returned to my room to grab my backpack. Drake and I spent the day at the mobile building out at the expedition site. I had to repair a pneumatic line on the ROV, while Drake handled occasional software issues. For the rest of the day, we quietly discussed how to confront Roger about last night's incident. Initially, we considered building up to a confrontation, testing him slowly with questions and small challenges. But as the hours passed and we reviewed what we had witnessed, we realized there was only one option: ask him directly. Avoiding the truth would only prolong the inevitable. The expedition site was a mix of normal work and suppressed anxiety. We whispered among ourselves while everyone else focused on the controls of the ROV, and we carefully watched for any signs of erratic behavior in Roger. By the time we wrapped up, the sun had fully set, leaving us under the harsh glare of the vehicle-mounted floodlights. The snow fell steadily, reducing visibility and casting ghostly shadows over the terrain. Back at base camp, Drake and I leapt from the snowcrawler, anxious to return indoors. Our worries were momentarily relieved when we saw Roger sitting alone at the kitchen table, calmly drinking a pre-dinner White Russian. Somehow he had maintained his routine despite everything that had occurred the night before. We silently grabbed beers from the fridge and took a seat across from him, preparing ourselves for the confrontation. Before I could speak, Roger raised his hand, halting me mid-sentence. I watched silently as he drained the remaining liquid from his glass and set it down with a soft clink. "I know exactly what the two of you want," he said casually, almost with a smirk, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I've been waiting all day for you to return from the site." He chuckled lightly. "You know, it's really not pleasant being left alone with your thoughts. I never realized I had so much darkness inside me." Drake and I exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond. We simply sat there, silent, tense, as Roger seemed to build his own momentum. After a moment, he reached for my open beer bottle, lifting it to his lips and draining it in a few large gulps. Then, without warning, he hurled it against the cinder block wall of the kitchen. The crash was deafening, glass shattered everywhere, fragments scattering across the floor. I nearly jumped out of my chair, heart hammering. What the hell is the matter with you, Roger?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. David and a few others had begun gathering around, drawn by the sound, but Roger, however, remained seated, his sick, demented smile back in place. That same smile I had seen last night, the one that had made my blood run cold. It now radiated a confidence that was terrifying in its composure. Slowly, he turned, scanning the faces of our fellow colleagues who had come to investigate. His eyes glimmered with something I couldn't place: amusement, madness, or perhaps an understanding that no one else could comprehend. I swallowed hard. Whatever happened last night wasn't over. I realized then that the danger, the shape, and whatever influence it had over Roger were far from behind us. And as I sat there in the kitchen, feeling the weight of every cold snowflake outside and the heavy silence inside, I understood that this confrontation
was only the beginning. "There's nothing to worry about here, boys," Roger said with a chuckle that chilled me to the bone. "I think I've just had a few too many to drink." He reached across the table, grabbed Drake's half-empty beer and lifted it up for everyone to see, like proof of his innocence. His laugh was too casual, too rehearsed, and yet the others bought it. One by one, they muttered dismissive comments and drifted back to their rooms. Even David left, though as he passed, I caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Fear. When the den finally cleared, silence pressed down like a weight. Roger turned back to me. His eyes were sharp, burning with hatred that made my throat tighten. He rose slowly, every movement deliberate, then rested a heavy hand on my shoulder. He leaned in close, his hot breath brushing my ear. "It won't spare a single one of us," he whispered. His voice was low, jagged, almost gleeful. "We all have our faults, but some have more than others. Compared to me, you're a saint, but that doesn't mean it'll spare you. It may end your life without pain. I, on the other hand, may not be so lucky." He patted my shoulder twice, mocking, almost affectionate, then turned and walked away. As he disappeared down the hall, I caught one last glimpse of his eyes. Hatred, deep and unmistakable. I turned to Drake. He didn't look at me. He stared at the empty corner Roger had vanished into, his face pale, a single tear gliding down his cheek. Day 22. My hands are shaking as I type this. Forgive the errors. Sleep has been impossible since that night. I can't close my eyes without seeing Roger's smile, without hearing his words echoing in my skull. It isn't enough that the shape stalks us outside in the dark. Now the danger has followed us inside, wearing the face of a man I once trusted. Roger hasn't broken his routine. He laughs at meals. He sits through movies. He chats with David like nothing's wrong. But I know better. Whenever I pass him in the mornings, his eyes follow me. Not the eyes of a colleague, not even the eyes of a man. They burn with hatred, with knowledge he isn't sharing. I tell myself that ignoring him will make it stop, but each day it gets worse. Tonight, the entire base gathered in the den. Only a week left out here, one last push before home. We cracked open the final cases of beer, dug through what schnacks we had left. After that, it'd be down to whiskey and vodka, but none of us cared. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe. I even kicked my shoes off and threw my feet onto the coffee table. With everyone here in one room, Roger couldn't corner me. For the first time in a week, I felt safe. But then I noticed it. The chair to my right was empty. Roger had been there when the movie started, but now gone. I scanned the room twice, my pulse racing, praying I had overlooked him. I hadn't. My chest tightened. He wasn't in here. He was somewhere else. I tried to keep calm, tried not to draw attention, but then I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow stretched across the snow, cast long and sharp under the floodlights outside. It slid across my field of vision, slow, deliberate, before slipping out of sight. "There's someone out there," I whispered, eyes fixed on the window. David and Drake sat beside me on the couch. They leaned in. "Sorry, didn't catch that. What did you say?" I swallowed hard and raised my voice, my whisper breaking into something closer to a shout. "I said, there's someone out there." That got everyone's attention. The room hushed, the laughter and chatter dying instantly. Even the movie paused mid-frame as my boss, irritated, set down the remote. "Damn it, McRady, what the hell are you blabbering about this time?" I shot him a glare, my arms shaking as I pointed toward the glass. "You damn well heard me. I said there's someone out there." And in that moment, I realized something awful. I didn't know if I was pointing at the shape or at Roger?
My boss scowled at me, then stalked over to the window and pressed his face against the glass to peer out. For a second, I thought he'd call me crazy. Then his eyes widened, and his jaw dropped. By God, he's right. Someone's out there. It's Roger, I muttered, and jumped to my feet. I pulled my parka on in one motion and bolted for the door. Others scrambled after me, jackets and scarves flapping. The snow underfoot made that hollow crunch we'd come to hate. I cut around the corner of the building and found Roger kneeling in the powder. I slowed and stopped about 6 feet away, putting my hand up without thinking, a silent order. One by one, the others skidded to a halt behind me. The wind whistled, loud as a warning. I turned to the group and forced my voice into something like authority. "Stay where you are. Don't move unless I say so." They all nodded. Even then, the whole scene felt unreal. The pale floodlight, the way the snow swallowed sound, the rigid figure of Roger hunched over something on the ground. I closed the distance and walked around him, trying to read the situation without invading his space. Clenched in his fist was a straight razor. The blade flashed in the light like some obscene trophy. My eyes landed next on the green stain in the snow. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. "Antifreeze," he said, oddly proud. I'd expected a crude answer or a snarl, not that casual tone. Instinctively, I reached for the small knife I always carried, drew it from my waistband, and held the tip out toward him, a quiet threat for anyone who tried anything. "Stay back," I told the others. "Keep your distance and be ready." They all nodded. Even then, the whole scene felt unreal. The pale floodlight, the way the snow swallowed sound, the rigid figure of Roger hunched over something on the ground. I closed the distance and walked around him, trying to read the situation without invading his space. Clenched in his fist was a straight razor. The blade flashed in the light like some obscene trophy. My eyes landed next on the green stain in the snow. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. "Antifreeze," he said, oddly proud. I had expected a crude answer or a snarl, not that casual tone. I drew the knife out from my waistband and held the tip out toward him, a quiet threat for anyone who tried anything. "Stay back," I told the others. "Keep your distance and be ready." Roger didn't look at us. His gaze was fixed out beyond the camp, into the dark where the mountain fell away. He moved like a man asleep at the wheel, slow, methodical. "Please, Roger, hand over the razor," I said, "before someone gets hurt." He finally turned. Whatever had been outside had been waiting a long time to see him, because his face looked wind-burned and ancient. Frost clung to his hair. He rose to his feet without a word, and oddly, everyone took a breath that got caught in their throats. He lifted the blade. The air snapped around us. People made small, involuntary noises behind me, shifts of feet, a swallowed curse. Then he swung the razor with a voice that was more a command than a plea. "All of you better back to fuck up right now." We obeyed. No one moved closer. "Think about what you're doing, Roger," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I could feel Drake right behind me, breathing shallow, clutching that little cross in his palm. He laughed, but it was thin. He brought the blade up closer to his face, as if reading the label. "What I'm about to do," he said, almost conversational. "I fucked my life beyond repair. Anything else I do can't possibly make it worse." He stood up straighter and never broke eye contact with me. I couldn't tell if he was pleading for understanding
or damnation. He tilted his head back, drew a slow breath that steamed in the cold, and exhaled like a man making peace. It's not happy with us right now. In fact, it's downright pissed at quite a few of you. You all got more time. Me, my time's up. He smiled then, not kindly. It says my death will be easy. I go first. Then, with a motion no one could stop, he pressed the blade to his throat and dragged it across. The sound of tearing flesh was hideous and immediate. Dark red spurted out and stained the snow in thick ribbons. The floodlights caught the blood and threw it back at us like something obscene and beautiful. Someone behind me retched. Another person gagged. I heard a retch, then the dull thud of someone collapsing. Someone had fainted. For a moment, nothing made sense except the cold and the crimson spreading across white. My hands were already slick from adrenaline. I took a step forward, then stopped. There was no script for this. Roger's head lolled back, his chest heaved once. He didn't seem to be screaming, but the whole world screamed anyway. The sound of someone vomiting, someone crying out, the brittle crack of snow under panicked feet. I grabbed his collar of his jacket and pulled him toward me with everything I had. The blood painted my gloves. Up close, his eyes were open, but unfocused, like a man possessed by something that owed him nothing. Someone else finally found their voice and shouted for a medic. Someone else ran to the radio. We dragged him inside. The room smelled of metal and cold and something far worse, of endings. Around us, faces were empty, stunned, and for a second I thought the shape had come inside with him. Roger's life was ending in a smear on the snow, and the stunned silence of men who'd watched a slow-motion tragedy. We'd been warned through whispers and madness, and still, nothing had prepared us for the sight of one of our own choosing that end. I write this with hands that still won't stop trembling. The base is in chaos, shouts, the dead-eyed stare of colleagues who've seen too much. Outside, the mountain looms, and somewhere up there, the shape waits, patient, as always. We're not safe. Not anymore.
Roger dropped to his knees with a heavy thud, his parka darkening as the blood kept pouring. The razor slipped from his trembling hand, spinning once before it disappeared into the snow, as if the earth itself swallowed it. For a moment, there was silence, just the hollow wind sweeping across camp. Yet the sound of blood gushing from his torn neck broke the stillness. It sprayed in rhythmic bursts, splattering the snow with a sickly red shine. He opened his mouth like he wanted to speak, maybe one last word, one last desperate thought clawing its way out, but nothing came. Only a wet, gargling sound that made my stomach twist violently. I clamped a hand over my mouth, fighting back the bile that surged up my throat. His eyes rolled back, the whites showing, before his body pitched forward, hitting the snow face first. The crimson pooled, spreading beneath him in a shape that reminded me of wings. Behind me, the group erupted. Some cried out, others rushed forward, ignoring my earlier command to stay back. A few collapsed onto their knees, retching into the snow, while another fainted outright. Boots crunched as they crowded Roger's body, desperate to see, desperate to confirm what their minds already knew but didn't want to accept. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes weren't on Roger anymore. They were fixed on the horizon. Out beyond the floodlights, past the thin veil of blowing snow, the shape stood, that black mass, that impossible figure. It was closer now, halfway between the mountain's base and our camp. Yesterday, it had only been a quarter of the way down. I'd been watching it for days, measuring its progress, convincing myself it barely moved at all. But now it was undeniable. It was coming. Even though it was nothing more than a silhouette, a blot of solid black against the white, I could feel it staring back at me, not at us, at me. Deep, cold, invasive, like it wanted to hollow me out from the inside.
Day 23. We pieced together what Roger had done. He hadn't just lost his mind, he'd sabotaged us. He cut the radiator tubes of the snow crawlers, leaving antifreeze spilling into the snow like veins of green ice. By morning, the engines had frozen solid, completely useless. Sure, we could patch the tubes easily enough, but the spare antifreeze? Gone. Roger had slashed open every last container. Our boss wasted no time. He got on the radio and called for assistance. The voice on the other end promised help. Replacement snow crawlers were being flown out. A couple days, they said. Just hold on. That morning, we voted. The mission was over. No more pretending we could stick it out. No more data. No more science. We were going home as soon as transport arrived. The others only seemed saddened by Roger's suicide. They whispered about how hopeless he must have felt, how the cold and isolation finally broke him. Only Drake and I knew the truth. Roger hadn't killed himself out of despair. He'd been manipulated, twisted by something none of us wanted to name. If we told them, if we admitted he slit his throat because of the shape, panic would tear through the camp like fire. No, better to let them believe it was just madness. Day 24. Everything collapsed again. We woke to find the radio smashed beyond repair. Someone had gone in during the night with an axe, swinging until nothing remained but jagged metal, shattered glass, and splintered circuits strewn across the floor. Our last tether to the outside world, gone. Our boss wasted no time. He got in the radio and called for assistance. The voice on the other end promised help. Replacement snow crawlers were being flown out. A couple days, they said. Just hold on. We woke to find the radio smashed beyond repair. Someone had gone in during the night with an axe, swinging until nothing remained but jagged metal, shattered glass, and splintered circuits strewn across the floor. Our last tether to the outside world, gone. We all gathered in the radio room, staring at the wreckage in stunned silence. My boss stood at the center, fists clenched, eyes burning with fury. Slowly, he turned to face us. "I've had enough of this," he growled. His voice was low at first, but the rage bled through every syllable. "From this moment on, there's a curfew. If I see a single one of you outside your rooms after 10 p.m. without my permission," he pulled the pistol from his waistband in one swift motion. Bang! The shot echoed like thunder, bouncing off every wall, rattling glass, making my ears ring. Smoke curled from the hole in the wooden floorboards where he'd fired. A warning, a promise. I will shoot. No one dared to speak. My throat tightened as I tried to form words, but fear strangled me silent. "I'll say it one more time," he barked, his voice booming now, a roar that pinned us in place. "Past 10, if I catch you outside your rooms, I'll put you down myself.
do I make myself clear?" We all nodded like terrified children. Not a voice rose in protest. "I said, do I make myself clear?" he thundered again, stepping forward, waving the pistol. "Yes, sir," we said together, voices thin and quivering. "Good." His shoulders eased slightly, but his eyes still blazed with paranoia. "Now get the hell out of here. I don't care what you do, so long as you stay inside. I'll be patrolling. If I find anyone where they shouldn't be," he tapped the barrel of the gun against his palm, "I won't hesitate." We scattered, no one daring to meet each other's eyes. Fear had rooted deep in us, now spreading like frost through our veins. And somewhere out in the night, the shape waited, closer with every passing hour.
Drake's hand landed on my shoulder as we shuffled out of the meeting room, steering me to the back of the group like he'd always done when something needed to be said quietly. He leaned in, voice barely a breath. "Follow me to our room. There's something I want to show you." We stepped inside and he locked the door behind us. He moved to the window and peered out, making sure no one was watching. Only after he'd satisfied himself that we were alone did he crouch down, slide under the bed, and ease out a long metal case. He fumbled with a pocket, produced a key, and unlocked it. The lid cracked open, and the hit of cold metal made me want to step back. A double-barrel shotgun lay snug in foam, barrels polished and fore-end glinting. I stared at it for a beat too long. "Jesus, Drake, why the hell did you bring this?" I asked, incredulous. "Because I don't trust some people," he said simply, as if that were explanation enough. He lifted the gun and held it out, palm steady. "I know it sounds paranoid, but I brought it for protection. For me, for my family, and right now, for you. You're the only person here I trust." He shoved the shotgun into my hands. It was heavier than I expected, cold and substantial, every part of it a promise of violence I'd never wanted to make. My father had kept guns in a cabinet when I was a kid, but I'd never taken one apart, never considered altering one. The idea of taking it to the shop and modifying it made my stomach twist. "I want you to take it to your shop and cut the barrels. Shorten them up. Give it more kick." I looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Drake, are you serious? That's illegal. How am I supposed to sneak into the shop without the boss seeing me? You heard him. He'll shoot anyone outside past curfew. We get caught, we're finished." Drake held up a finger to hush me. He reached into another pocket and produced an orange pill bottle. He twisted the cap and dumped a few pale tablets into his palm. The smell of the plastic made my scalp prickle. "That's why we're going to give him one of these," he said, calm as a man talking about weather. He held the bottle out like a prop in a play. I blinked. "What are those?" "Suvorexin. Sleeping pills. I took one the first few nights. Helps with insomnia." His jaw tightened. "Slip it in his drink. He'll conk out. We get a window. That's all we need." A headache began to bloom between my eyes. The plan sounded insane, reckless, and criminal in equal measure. "You can't be serious, Drake. Drugging the boss? Sneaking around at night? If he wakes and catches us?" "Normal?" Drake cut in, his voice flat. "What part of any of this is normal, John? Someone out there is making men slit their throats. Someone smashed our radio. Someone sabotaged the snow crawlers. Roger destroyed our antifreeze, and then that. If you're waiting for normal to return, you'll be waiting until the mountain eats us alive." He was calm, and that's what scared me. The old Drake would have laughed this off, made a joke, and gone back to his emails. This Drake, controlled, convinced, terrible in the clarity of his reasoning, was different. I stood there, the shotgun suddenly heavy in my hands. Two terrible choices weighing on me. Do nothing and hope we're lucky, or do something that would make us as culpable as the danger we faced. I reached out, took the bottle from him, feeling its cheap plastic between my fingers, and understood the point of no return had arrived. We waited until dinner. The base smelled of cooking meat and hot oil, and the den thrummed with the low hum of people trying to pretend everything was normal. When the food went out on the long table, Drake and I drifted toward the kitchen while the others queued. He moved with practiced ease, like a man who'd rehearsed small deceptions before. "Want a drink?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, the bottle tucked into my palm. "Yeah, and make one for the boss and Matthews, too." My throat closed. I wasn't proud of what we were about to do. I wasn't even sure how to justify it to myself. But when I looked at Drake, hands steady, jaw set, I saw the raw edge of someone who didn't want to die under an indifferent sky. We mixed drinks. I kept my hands steady, the little orange pills weightless between my fingers. I told myself it was temporary, that it was for survival, no more and no less. I placed the cup in front of our boss, watched him lift it with a distracted nod, and felt like a thief in my own body. When he settled into his chair and the den buzzed with the low noise of camaraderie and the clink of cutlery, I knew we'd crossed a line. There was no turning back. Whatever happened next would not be simple or clean. The shotgun lay waiting in my shop, a cold, humming promise. The pills were a shortcut we had chosen. Both felt like answers and sins at once. Outside, the mountain pressed in, patient and indifferent. Inside, we had made our choice. Now, we had to live with it.
I felt a small, guilty thrill when my boss took a sip and made that face. For a second there, I thought I might keel over at any moment from nerves. He frowned at the glass. My God, this whiskey is terrible. Relief flooded me so hard I nearly laughed out loud. I set the other drinks down, keeping my hands steady. "Don't expect quality when the federal government's footing the bill," I said, trying for a joke. He shrugged and finished the glass off. Drake caught my eye and winked. Now all we had to do was wait. It was around 11 when the boss finally crashed on a couch in the den. His breathing evened, and the room slumped into that half-awake hum where people pretend to be asleep. Drake and I slipped from our chairs, the shotgun tucked under my parka like a hot secret. He'd stashed a pistol in his waistband, one more weight tucked into his coat, just in case. He'd managed to pull it from the supply room before the boss locked it down. I still didn't like the sensation of carrying a real weapon, but necessity had a way of hardening the edges of you. We eased out the front door without slamming it, letting the cold close behind us like a soft, indifferent hand. The wind clawed at our jackets. We hugged the building's shadow and crouched under the eaves whenever a window threatened to gaze down at us. The snow bit through the knit of my gloves. Each breath came as a short white cloud. My shop door was a blessing of warmth when we finally shoved it open. For a moment the world narrowed to the saw and the vise and the metal under my hands. I set the shotgun in the vise, the whole thing too real in my palms, and felt the responsibility of it like a weight on my chest. The powering up of the saw felt obscene, comforting in its normalcy, and within 30 seconds the barrel surrendered. Sparks, a rasp, a shiver of metal. I filed the edge clean with methodical hands. We exchanged a look that said everything. This is madness, and it is necessary. We peeled off our outer layers and slipped back toward camp, keeping our footsteps small. The night was unrelenting, wind-lashed and hollow. My stomach twisted with each step. Then the hallway light snapped on and framed a figure in the doorway. Our boss, axe in hand, standing like a watchman carved from malice. He'd woken early. He knew. "It's not happy that you disobeyed its commands. You will be punished." The words had a clarity that let no room for bargaining. I had time to fumble the shotgun out of my jacket. My hand closed on the stock, fingers numb. Before I could shoulder it, he lunged. The axe slammed into the doorframe where our heads had been a heartbeat before. Wood splintered, splinters flying like small stars. We hit the floor as the blade chewed into the threshold. The building shook with the force of it. We scrambled to our feet with our backs sliding along the concrete. He pulled the axe free and turned on us, eyes burning.
All you boys had to do was listen to me. Was it really that fucking difficult? He swung again. The impact shattered concrete and sent up dust. Behind me, people were peeking from rooms, paralyzed between running and staying. Fear had frozen the others. He raised the axe, poised to bring it down. Drake and I moved in a single, clumsy motion. I pointed the shortened barrel directly at his chest and pulled the trigger. The report was monstrous in that close, enclosed space. It knocked the breath from my lungs and set my ears ringing deeper than the wind. The boss staggered backward as if someone had punched him through bone. The axe slipped from his hands and clanged to the floor. I stared as a dark bloom spread across his white shirt, a grotesque, impossible flower. He slid down the wall, fingers finding purchase on drywall, hands smeared with his own blood. For a stilted second, he looked almost small, like a man who'd finally been outmaneuvered by a thing he thought he controlled. He went slack and toppled to his side. The room was a chorus of horrified noises, gasping, a wet, coughing sound, a single sudden sob from somewhere near the sink. I'd never killed anyone. The thought of it shuddered through me like a current. My handgun hand shook so hard I had to brace the shotgun against my shoulder for fear of dropping it. You killed him!" someone cried, voice thin and breaking. The words landed like a verdict, and I could feel them reverberate through the den. Faces turned toward me, eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning animal panic. Drake's cross had fallen from his clenched fist and lay on the floor, forgotten. I couldn't answer. My throat was full of the metallic tang of adrenaline and cold, and something that tasted like regret. Around us, the base filled with the noise of people unmooring from a fragile safety. Footsteps, whispered accusations, the clatter of chairs pushed back. The shape waited outside, indifferent to our chaos. Up on the mountain, the figure was still there, patient, closer than it had been, and whatever it wanted, whatever it had been shaping this whole time, had just taken a step that none of us could undo.
I turned to see Drake still on the floor, his body trembling, his face pale and drenched in fear, his wide eyes locked onto mine. And it was then that the weight of what I had just done came crashing down. I had killed a man. My boss, yes, a violent, deranged man who had attacked us with an axe, but still a man. A human life had ended because of me. And that realization clung to my chest like chains pulling me underwater. Justification didn't matter. Logic didn't matter. What I felt in that moment was not victory, not even survival, but a hollow sickness deep inside me. I stayed on the floor, my breathing shallow, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of it. Around us, doors creaked open and footsteps shuffled into the hallway. The others, drawn by the gunshot, emerged cautiously from their rooms. Their hushed voices swirled like a low fog in the air, but I didn't hear a word of it. My ears still rang from the blast, and my mind was far from their whispers. I pushed myself up and walked unsteadily to the nearest window, desperate for something, anything to pull me away from the blood soaking into the concrete. What I saw outside nearly made my knees buckle. "Oh, God," I whispered, breathless. The shape was closer now. No longer a distant shadow, it lingered at the edges of our floodlights. The pale beams barely reached its form, but I could still see it. Unmistakable and horrifying. A towering silhouette, frozen but watching. The shotgun slipped from my grasp and clattered to the floor, though I barely registered the sound. My world was nothing but ringing, dread, and the faint glow of that impossible figure. My vision narrowed, blackness creeping in at the edges until the room dissolved completely. The last thing I felt was the impact of my head striking the concrete floor. Day 25. I woke in my room to find Drake and a few others gathered around me. As soon as I tried to sit up, Drake rushed forward, his face etched with worry. "Easy, take it slow," he said, his hand steadying me. Pain flared the moment I moved, a sharp, pulsing ache that wrapped around my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, groaning as the wave subsided. "Shit," I hissed through clenched teeth. "You're lucky. No concussion, but you've got a nasty bruise. Looks ugly, but you'll live." He handed me a glass of water and a pair of painkillers. I swallowed them gratefully, the cool water soothing my raw throat. "If you're up to it," he added, "we need to meet. I think, after everything, it's time." I nodded, though my body protested every movement. "Yeah," I said quietly, "we can't keep ignoring this." We gathered in the kitchen. Everyone sat around the long table, the silence so thick it was suffocating. Eyes darted nervously, glances broken as soon as they met. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but we all knew why we were here. "We won't get anywhere if you all just sit there," I finally said, my voice sharper than intended. "Someone needs to speak up." The silence lingered until a heavy sigh came from my left. David. He hadn't spoken much since Roger's death, but now his voice cracked through the stillness. "Please," he whispered, his hands trembling against the table. "Please tell me I'm not the only one who's seen it." The room stiffened. Drake tried to respond, but only small, broken sounds escaped his throat. My own chest tightened. What did you say?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. David looked at me, his eyes wet with desperation. "It's out there. I saw it not long after we arrived. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mind, a shadow, a hallucination, but it's real." He dropped his head into his hands, shaking. None of us dared interrupt. When he finally raised his face again, tears streamed freely down his cheeks. Roger saw it too, a few days before what happened to him. He told me he'd noticed something outside, standing at the edge of the lights. He thought he was losing his mind. When I admitted I saw it too, he was relieved. Relieved because it meant he wasn't insane. We kept quiet, hoping maybe it would just disappear. But it hasn't. His voice cracked. He pushed back from the table and staggered into the kitchen. None of us moved. A moment later, he returned with a glass of ice and a half-empty bottle of rum. Without word, he poured a full glass and downed it in one burning gulp. The silence returned, but now it was heavier, laced with a shared truth we could no longer deny. The shape was real, and it was watching us.
One morning, I woke up to find him at the window again, the same way he'd been for days, motionless, like a sentinel made of bone and habit. I tried to rouse him, but he didn't answer. I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder. When he turned, I saw it. Blood pouring from his nostrils, bright and relentless, soaking the front of his shirt. I'd seen cuts and scrapes before, but never anything that gushed like this. It ran in dark rivers down his neck and soaked the fabric until it clung to his chest. He stumbled to the bathroom and stayed in there for at least an hour. I knocked once, mumbled something I don't remember, and eventually gave up. When he reappeared, he acted like nothing had happened. "Want to make some breakfast?" he asked, wiping his face with a towel as if he had merely sneezed. We made coffee, ate toast, and talked like two men who had not been staring over the edge of something impossible the night before. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged in my throat like ice. He refilled his glass and swallowed hard. Though his crying had stopped, wet streaks still shone on his cheeks. He looked small, helpless, and for a beat I hated myself for not having the courage to say the obvious. Your roommate is falling apart. Tell someone. Get help. Is it really that hard to tell someone your roommate's losing it? The voice cut across the room like a thumb on a frozen pane. It belonged to the doctor we'd brought along, a quiet man who'd been unusually silent since Roger's death. His question landed with the sharpness of a thrown stone. David slammed his glass down in reply. The rim chipped. "Do you think it's easy? Tell everyone that you're seeing something out the window? Some thing? And watch how fast they lock you up or laugh you out of here?" A murmur rose and died. We were all skirting the edge of confession, but the room's air was heavy enough to drown in. Then someone else spoke, slow and flat, and the sound sent a different kind of shock through the circle. "You're not the only one," the mechanic said. He'd been one of the quiet types,
the sort who keeps to himself and judges people by the way they treat tools. He stared down at the table as if he had swallowed broken glass. David's face shifted from anger to something raw. "You too?" he breathed. "You're not the only one who's seen it," the mechanic repeated, and everyone turned. The silence that followed stretched and snapped like a brittle wire. He leaned forward, fingers tracing a circle on the table. It started on the mountainside, like it does for everyone. I thought I'd been staring too long, that the cold was doing a number on me. Then it started showing up in my dreams. Night and day, it's there, standing, watching. It's getting closer. I don't know what it wants, and I'm damn sure I do not want to find out. The confession made the air taste metallic. I felt the room tilt slightly, like the whole base had just been shifted onto a different axis. What began as stray sightings and nervous jokes had become a shared reality. The shape wasn't a man's private madness anymore. It was ours. I took a long, hard swallow of David's rum and set the glass down. Needed courage, not more drink, but the heat steadied me. "All right," I said, feeling the words settle like stones in my chest. "Show of hands, how many of you have actually seen it?" Arms rose one by one around the table, like the slow disclosure of a secret. No theatrics, no bravado, just an exhausted, horrible acknowledgement. Every hand that went up was another life dragged into the same orbit of terror. I continued. "This is a start. Has anyone seen it move, make a sound, do anything besides stand there?" A few shook their heads. The rest kept their mouths shut, which told me more than words could. The silence was a confession of its own. Some things we did not want to say out loud. I slammed my fist on the table hard enough to make the chipped porcelain jump. A few heads jerked. "I don't want to see anyone here sulking or hiding anymore. We are not in a situation where hemming and hawing helps. I expect cooperation. If we're going to get through this, we do what needs to be done. No whining, no cowardice." A scoff came from the far end of the table. "And who made you leader, McRady?" Someone sneered. The question was cheap, meant to cut. I reached under my jacket. My fingers closed around cold wood and metal. When I pulled the shotgun free, the room inhaled as one. The little weapon rested in my palm like an accusation. "This did," I said. My voice was flat. The barrel glinted under the kitchen light, the sight of it filling the hollow left by jokes and excuses. It was impromptu authority, necessary, ugly, and utterly real. We stared at the gun, and then at each other. Outside, the wind howled across the snow, and something further up on the mountain shifted, patient and inexorable. Inside, we were no longer a crew of professionals and co-workers. We were a cluster of frightened people with a shared fact. The shape is real, and now that we'd all seen it, whatever comes next is no longer the burden of one man's imagination.
"Not to mention," I continued, my voice steadier than it had any right to be, "that I am the only one here willing to lead us toward progress, instead of sitting around in silence, waiting to die. I intend on making it out of this place alive, and I won't let any of you stop me. Those who wish to join me are free to do so. Those who don't, just stay out of my way. I don't want another violent altercation." The words left my mouth with a force I had never known myself capable of. For the first time since arriving here, I felt something akin to authority, real, commanding authority. And for a fleeting second, pride swelled in my chest. But that pride was immediately shattered by the sound of laughter. Harsh, unhinged, it echoed around the room like jagged glass scraping metal. My head snapped toward the sound, and I saw who it was. The mechanic, the same man who had confessed earlier to seeing the shape, was now doubled over, cackling like someone who had just heard the funniest joke of his life. Except there was no humor in his laughter. It was manic. Wrong. What the hell is so funny? I demanded, tightening my grip on the shotgun. He straightened, his face twisted into a grotesque smile, and locked eyes with me. The look in them was not his own. Nothing you do is going to make a difference. It won't let you escape. A cold shiver knifed through my spine. My stomach dropped as the realization clawed at me. The shape had found another puppet. "Everybody back away from him," I shouted, leveling the shotgun at his chest. Chairs screeched and toppled as everyone scrambled to the far end of the room, huddling behind me. The mechanic didn't flinch. He just kept smiling. To my side, I heard Drake pull the pistol from his waistband. The metallic click of the slide being drawn back filled the silence. "Don't you see?" the mechanic said, his voice almost sing-song, as though he were reciting a nursery rhyme. "There's no point in resisting. The plan's already in place. Nothing you do will change it." "What plan?" Drake demanded, his tone razor-sharp. The mechanic's grin widened. "It doesn't want me to reveal the details. Not yet." And he lifted his wrist and checked his watch, as though he had an appointment. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I really should be going. Feel free to join me later. Where I'm headed, the weather is warm. Much warmer than this frozen hell."
We stared, baffled, struggling to decipher his meaning. But before we could act, he reached into his jacket and produced a pistol of his own. The sight of it made my heart jolt. "Wait!" someone cried from behind me. But there was no waiting. He pressed the barrel against his lips, tilted his head back, and without hesitation pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the confined space. My ears rang as his skull burst apart, fragments of bones spraying across the room. Strings of hair, chunks of flesh, and globs of brain matter painted the wall behind him in grotesque patterns. His body lurched forward, hitting the table with a sickening thud, before slumping lifelessly into his chair. His eyes, rolled back white, stared at nothing. Gasps, sobs, and shouts erupted around me. Some cursed his name. Others cried in shock. But Drake and I didn't move. Our attention had shifted to the window. Out there, under the pale cone of the spotlights, stood the shape, perfectly still, featureless, watching. Even under the glare, its body betrayed no detail, just an unnatural void in the snow. Day 32. Some of them have stopped pretending. Hope is gone. The snow crawlers were supposed to arrive this morning. They didn't. I tried to reassure everyone, told them delays happen, that maybe they'd show tomorrow or the next day. No one believed me. I can't afford to let despair show on my face, even if I feel it clawing at me. I'm their leader now, whether I want to be or not. If I falter, the last shred of stability in this camp will collapse. Day 35. Things are unraveling. You can feel it in the air, the tension, the suspicion, the unspoken hatred. Only a few days ago, we still greeted one another in the mornings. The smiles were strained, but they were there. A shared acknowledgement that we were still human. That's gone now. People barely look at each other. They skulk from their rooms only when they must, darting to the kitchen, to the bathroom, before vanishing back into isolation. Even Drake, my closest ally, can feel the change. It's as though the shape isn't just standing out there anymore. It's worming its way inside. This morning proved it. Drake and I were at the table in the den, hunched over our notes, going through possible escape scenarios if we were forced to abandon camp. The silence was broken by one of the ROV pilots. He sprinted from his room, wild-eyed, like a man starving. He threw open the fridge, grabbed a pack of raw hamburger meat, and bolted back into his room without a word. Then we heard it. For
For the next 10 minutes, the walls echoed with the wet, revolting sound of tearing and chewing. Meat devoured raw, like an animal crouched over prey. Drake and I exchanged a look, but said nothing. What could we say? I'm not just worried anymore. I'm terrified. This isn't simple cabin fever. This is something darker, hungrier. They aren't just restless. They don't just mistrust one another. They're changing. And I can't shake the feeling that violence is coming. That soon someone else will snap. And when they do, the shape will be waiting.
Day 37. Today, Drake and I finally came to a decision, one that may be our last real chance at survival. We're going to attempt to repair one of the snow crawlers. Roger, in his madness, had drained every vehicle of antifreeze and sliced open the coolant lines, leaving us stranded in this frozen wasteland. For weeks, I've stared at those hulking machines, useless shells in the snow, and wondered if there was any way to bring one back to life. Now, with the walls of this place closing in and the others losing their grip on sanity, we've decided it's worth the risk. I spent part of the morning combing through my shop, searching for anything that could substitute the ruined lines. At last, I found several lengths of rubber hose. Nothing perfect, but enough to splice the system together. As for the antifreeze, we have no choice but to substitute with water. Drake and I pored over the owner's manual for over an hour, our fingers stiff from the cold as we traced the warnings scrawled in black ink. Water is a temporary solution, only used in emergencies when antifreeze is unavailable. This, if anything, is the definition of an emergency. I don't need the crawler to carry us across the continent. I just need it to move, to grind through the snow long enough to reach the radar station where our plane went down. If we can make it that far, maybe, just maybe, there's a chance of rescue. I went into David's room and asked if he still had the maps. Without a word, he rummaged through a metal container by his door and pulled one out, the paper creased and frayed from use. Together, the three of us spread it across the den table. Our eyes followed the twisting white terrain as we tried to trace a viable path. It would be treacherous in weather like this, but staying here is worse. I'd rather die in the attempt than waste away like a trapped animal in this frozen prison. Day 38. It took nearly all day, but at last we managed to bring the snow crawler back to life. David kept watch outside, scanning the horizon for signs of the shape, while Drake and I crawled beneath the steel beast. Hours passed as we wrestled with clamps and tightened bolts, our gloves stiff with frost and grease. I thought back to the long evenings I'd spent as a teenager helping my father repair his battered old car. Compared to this, those moments felt like child's play. Here, every adjustment was life or death. By late afternoon, we finally filled the patched radiator with water. We heated the oil pan with an external burner until it hissed and steamed, and then Drake turned the ignition. At first, the crawler only groaned, coughing out reluctant grunts as though mocking our efforts. But then, with a shudder that shook the frame, the engine turned over. Its low roar reverberated through the snow like a victory cry. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I thought I'd lost: hope. We trudged back toward the camp, our boots sinking into the snow. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement at the windows. The others were watching us. Their faces, pressed against the glass, were pale, hollow, and expressionless, their eyes vacant as if all traces of humanity had been drained from them. For a fleeting moment, I thought they were merely dazed, until I turned my head and saw what they were staring at: the shape. It had moved closer during the night. For weeks it had stood motionless at a distance, an eternal sentinel shrouded in the storm. But now it was closer, too close, its formless black mass swallowing the light from the spotlights that hid it. A chill sank into me deeper than the cold could ever reach.
We rushed inside and bolted the door behind us. David had just pulled dinner from the oven, and we sat together at the table in uneasy silence. No one else came out to join us. I tried calling them over the intercom, but the speakers only returned static. David's voice broke the quiet. He hadn't seen any of them leave their rooms in more than a day. The words churned in my gut like acid. I remembered the Rovi pilot devouring raw hamburger days earlier, the wet sound of tearing flesh echoing through the halls. Against my better judgment, I went to the refrigerator. The moment I opened it, my fears were confirmed. Almost all the raw meat was gone. I closed the door slowly, my stomach tightening as if to reject the thought of what they had done. Without a word, I left the kitchen and returned to my shop. When I came back, I carried a heavy chain and a padlock. I wrapped them around the fridge handles and snapped the lock into place. "I don't want a single one of them going back in there," I said firmly, testing the chain's weight. "If we're leaving, we need enough food to last us. If something happens, we'll need every scrap." David frowned. "What do you mean, if something happens? We're not planning some long expedition. The radar station is barely a day's journey. Granola bars, chips, bottled water, shouldn't that be enough?" I met his eyes, shaking my head. On paper, yes, but the shape won't just let us go. It will interfere. If the crawler breaks down, or if we're forced to continue on foot, we'll need more than snacks. Worst case scenario, we'll be out there longer than we imagine. The room fell silent. The only sound, the muffled hum of the crawler outside and the storm pressing against the walls. In my pocket, the key to the lock weighed heavier than steel. We had a way forward now, but I knew, deep down, that the hardest part was yet to come.
They sat in silence for a long beat, the kind that lets the worst thoughts settle into your bones. It occurred to me then that neither Drake nor David had truly considered a worst-case scenario, not the one where the rest of the camp had stopped acting like people and started acting like something else. I'd been turning the problem over for days. Apparently they hadn't. "What are we going to do about them?" Drake asked finally, the question stripped of bravado. "When the three of us are packed and ready to go, I'll unlock the fridge. They'll be fine for a few days eating the raw meat like they have been. Once we reach the radar station, we can call for a team to come pick them up." David's face folded into an expression I hadn't seen before, disbelief wrapped in anger. "So your plan is to lock them up like animals and leave? John, they're human beings." I pointed toward the hall that opened to the bedrooms. "Whatever those things are, they're not human anymore. They look like men, but the light's gone out of them. They grunt, they bolt into their rooms with raw meat, and they don't speak. They're savage. I'm not taking that risk. If one of them snaps while we're on the road, we're not getting to the radar station at all. Do you have a problem with that?" Neither of them said anything at first. I waited while they collected whatever dignity they could find. Then they both shook their heads slowly. "Tomorrow night, we leave. Pack light. Make food to take. After that, we're gone." "That sounds good with me," Drake agreed. I turned to David for confirmation. He steepled his fingers and nodded. "You're right. The sooner we go, the better." Dinner dissolved into silence. We dumped plates into the sink and retreated to our rooms to pack. I lay in bed later, trying to flatten the knot of fear into something manageable, when a sound reached me. A laugh, thin and wrong, drifting down the corridor. Drake, who hadn't slept well in days, sat up instantly. He heard it too. I unbolted our door and cracked it just enough to peer into the dim hall. Light spilled from the den. A shadow flitted across it, as if puppeteered by a hand I couldn't see. The sound of that cackle crawled along the walls, not the laugh of someone watching a sitcom, but a high, wet cackle that belonged in nightmares. Whoever was making that sound wasn't laughing at anything human. It was the sound of a thing pleased with itself. Day 39. We woke early, hollow-eyed and raw from little sleep. David had heard the laughter all night. His room backed onto the den, and the sounds had kept him from resting. We padded into the kitchen to find a ruin. Drawers were ripped out and contents strewn across the floor. The oven and microwave doors were shattered. Shelves lay on their sides like bodies. Whoever had been inside last night had torn the place apart. There was no point cleaning. David dug through the mess for ingredients and started preparing our rations, while I unlocked the supply room and grabbed everything I thought might be useful. I loaded tins, granola, water, spare gloves, and a couple of tools into a metal locker until I could barely shut the lid. I heaved it toward the door to take it out to the crawler and stopped dead. Someone stood in the doorway. For a second, the world narrowed to the white outline of that figure. A man-shaped thing with eyes that didn't aim anywhere so much as stare through you. My hand jerked to the pistol at my waist, the cold metal an instant comfort. I trained the barrel on his head and felt the tremor in my finger. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice rough with sleep and something deeper. The thing didn't move. It just regarded me like a puzzle being observed. "I'll give you one chance. Say it. What do you want?" My breath fogged as the question left me. Its lips peeled back in a slow smile. Blood dribbled from its mouth and streaked down its chin. Up close, you could see broken, bitten teeth, brown and jagged. The sight had the effect of a physical blow somewhere in my gut.
It reached into its pocket and drew out the handle of something, a bent scrap of metal. When I got closer, I saw it was a spatula from the kitchen, chewed and warped. Little tooth marks peppering the surface, dark with old blood. "You won't let us eat," it said, in a voice that was the wrong pitch for a man. It cocked its head and spat a little blood, then licked its lips. "It says soon we will feast." My patience snapped. I fired. The bullet smashed into the wall behind him, the recoil cracking through my arm. I had missed. For a second, the hollow silence after the shot felt like an answer. He didn't flinch. He just stared. "It grows stronger every day," he said, calm as a dying man's confession. "Your feeble weapons won't stop it. Give up and join us." The room hummed with the sound of people holding their breath. My thumb sore from the misfired gun, my chest pounding. I found I could barely make my hand steady enough to aim again. I could see now, not fear in his eyes, but certainty. He believed this thing. It had taken him over. I thought of the raw meat we'd found missing, of the sounds that had echoed down the corridors, of Roger's fall and the blood that never quite washed out of our memory. I thought of the shape on the mountain, patient and immovable, and of how it had crept closer the night Roger died. "Tomorrow," I said, voice low and deliberate. "We leave tomorrow night. Pack anything you want to take. If any of you want to stay..." I didn't finish the sentence. I couldn't. The mechanic's laughter, the chewing of the spatula, the way the thing smiled with bits of blood on its teeth, it all made the decision for me. Drake's pistol clicked softly as he re-racked the slide. David edged closer, hands in pockets, trying to look useful. Around us the others watched, strangers in the same terrible story. Outside, the wind smeared the world white, and high above the mountain, the silhouette of the shape waited like a question none of us wanted to answer. We would leave tomorrow. Whether we survived the crawl through the storm, whether we outran whatever that thing wanted, none of us could be sure. But staying felt worse than risking the unknown. The camp had fractured into husks, and our options had narrowed to a single ugly truth: survive or be consumed.
I fired again. The blast rang out, echoing through the cramped, dim room.
My shot went wide, slamming into the plaster. Splinters of wood and dust rained down, but I didn't care. My hands were shaking too violently to aim. "It's not so bad where we are," I muttered, my voice low and hollow, as if I were trying to convince myself more than anyone else. "We no longer have to worry ourselves with the problems of this world." I shut my eyes tightly, pulled the trigger until the clip ran dry, and turned my head away. I couldn't let the creature see my tears. I couldn't let anyone see how close I was to breaking. "John," a voice snapped behind me, sharper than the gunfire. "What in the living hell are you doing?" I opened my eyes to see Drake framed in the doorway, his expression twisted with alarm. The creature, whatever it had been, was gone. It had slipped back into the shadows of its room, vanishing as if it had never existed at all. I stammered, the words catching in my throat. "One of them. It was there. It wanted me to join them, but I wouldn't let it." Drake's frown softened, though only slightly. He shook his head and stepped closer. "You need sleep. You've barely closed your eyes these past 2 days. 5 hours, maybe less. Go, lie down. I'll finish packing the crawler. David's almost done with the food. Once he's finished, he can stand watch." I wanted to argue, to insist that I wasn't losing it, that what I saw was real, but exhaustion clung to me like a heavy coat. My nod was weak, defeated. I slid the pistol back into its holster, the weight at my side both comforting and damning. Drake's hand rested on my shoulder as he guided me down the hall. My legs felt like lead. By the time I collapsed onto the cot, the gunshot's echo was still rattling in my skull. And then, laughter. That sound again. High-pitched, mocking, like children playing just beyond the walls. I knew it wasn't real. I knew. Yet the sound gnawed at the edges of my sanity as I drifted into sleep. When I woke, Drake was shaking me gently. "Sun's almost down," he whispered. "It's time to go." I jolted upright, every nerve on edge. I grabbed the shotgun leaning against the bedpost, slung my laptop bag across my chest, and stuffed the portable charger into my pocket. Turning once more to the room we'd used as refuge, I felt only bitterness. I wasn't going to miss it, not a damn thing about it. In the den, David was waiting. The chains had been stripped from the fridge. He had left food behind for them, for those things. "So they don't starve while we're gone," he explained in a hushed voice. "Everyone got their gear?" His eyes darted between us. Drake and I raised our packs. "Good, then let's move. This place, it's getting under my skin." We headed for the exit. My pulse picked up as the cold brass handle came into reach. That's when I heard it. A sound. From the hallway. Not laughter this time. Grunting. Drake froze. "Am I the only one hearing that?" "No," I whispered. "I hear it too." Silence swallowed us whole. My grip tightened on the shotgun as I stared into the dim hall. The noise came again, louder, guttural, wet. Then a scream tore through the air, raw and agonizing. David's face tightened. "It sounds like one of them is hurt." "I don't care," I shot back, my voice sharp with finality. "But John," he protested, what if they're still human somewhere inside? They could be in pain, real pain." "They're not people," I snapped, my scowl cutting him off. "I'm leaving them raw food. That's more mercy than they deserve. You think they're luring us in? Because that's exactly what this is, a trap." David's jaw set stubbornly. Without another word, he dropped his pack and strode past me. "David, stop!" I lunged to grab him, but he shook me off. His hand closed on the door handle. He turned it slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding like a scream of their own. I sprinted after him, my gut churning. The door swung open. The smell hit me first. A rancid mix of iron and rot,
so strong it burned my nostrils. Then I saw it. One of them lay sprawled across the bed, motionless, eyes frozen wide open in terror, glassy and unblinking. His clothes were shredded, flung across the room like torn paper. His body was a map of violence, craters carved into flesh where others had bitten deep, gouges clawed into him where he had tried to resist. They hadn't just killed him, they had fed. I staggered forward, gagging as another wave of stench filled my lungs. Fecal matter, rotting meat, the sour tang of spilled blood. The horror of it was overwhelming, pressing down on me with suffocating weight. The worst part wasn't that he was dead. The worst part was knowing the others had chosen him, the weakest among them, and that if we stayed, one of us would be next.
I yanked the shotgun free from under my jacket the moment I heard movement, finger already resting on the trigger. A shape peeled itself out of the corner shadows and stumbled into the weak light, blood streaking from its mouth, wet trails running down its shirt. More followed, slipping from doorways like something slithering out of a drain, each one clutching a kitchen knife as if it were a talisman. I grabbed David by the shoulder and hissed, "Run!" We hit the hall together. Behind us, one of them screamed, and 100 boot steps pounded the floor in answer. "Grab our stuff! Get outside!" I shouted to Drake, barely trusting my own voice. He was already moving, backpacks in hand, cutting a path for us. The door burst open to the night, and I felt the cold like a slap. My boots tanged on the packed snow as I turned and slammed the door. I yanked the crowbar we'd used to scrape ice from the threshold and swung with everything I had. The handle sheared clean off, metal screaming, and the lock mechanisms inside gave with a series of sickening snaps. The sound was like a gunshot in that thin, hollow air. We didn't wait. The three of us sprinted for the snow crawler parked a short distance away, the headlights of other campers a smear of pale warmth behind us. David and Drake hit the front seats, and I shoved our packs into the rear, slamming the hatch down. The engine coughed, grabbed, and then the machine roared as if waking from a long, angry sleep. The searchlights on its roof squinted through the blowing flakes and painted the world in hard white slices. I peered out the back window and my stomach dropped. The shape stood at the front door of the camp now, huge and impossible, a black cliff above the snow. It hadn't followed us as we ran. For a dizzy second, I thanked whatever small mercy governed this place. Then the door exploded off its hinges, a clean arc of wood that sailed through the air and buried itself in a nearby snowbank. The screams that rose from the camp behind us were more animal than human, a sound so massive and awful that the night swallowed it whole. I looked away. I didn't want to see what it was doing. We rode for hours, headlights carving a path through the whiteness, the engine's thrum filling the cab and keeping something at bay. Sleep wanted me, hard. But every time I closed my eyes, the faces of those things at the camp crowded in, teeth glinting, mouths red. It felt like my head had been hollowed out and stuffed with those images. When dawn finally began to color the sky, we staggered into the radar station. It was smaller than I'd pictured in my head, a squat concrete box and a metal tower reaching into gray air. But it was shelter, and it had radios. We'd been driving in circles, once or twice. Fatigue and snow will do that. But David caught us before we wandered too far off course. We took turns behind the wheel because none of us could stay awake for long stretches. Whoever rode shotgun read the map. Whoever rode in back watched for that dark smear of nothing that might appear behind us. We radioed for help the moment we were inside. The voice on the other end said 2 days, give or take, before a rescue team could reach us. The weather was supposedly clear, a blessing we'd earned with sweat and fear. Still, the shape could appear at any time. It had showed us how quickly it could move. So we barricaded. We found plywood around the back of the station, miraculously intact, and nailed it over the windows, cutting narrow slits so we could still peer out like prisoners, peeking through bars. Every light that could give us away would be off at night. We turned the big antenna down and taped over small LEDs. Whoever built the place hadn't expected it to be used like a bunker, but desperate people make do. We argued, then agreed to sleep in separate rooms. There's a bitter honesty to admitting you don't trust your friends when the world's gone to hell, but it's also pragmatic. We gave the single small bedroom to David because he'd been the most stable, if that's the right word, and because he needed the rest more than either of us. Drake and I put cots in opposite corners of the den. We're on shifts now. One of us watches while the other sleeps. One walks the perimeter at dusk while the other cooks. The hours stretch long and flat, and the station smells of canned coffee and engine oil and our nervous sweat. Every creak makes my skin prickle, every shadow a candidate for horror. I check the slitted windows at least once an hour. The slits are so small they almost look stupid, but they let us see without being seen.
None of us know if the shape even knows this building exists. Maybe it doesn't care. Maybe it does. Maybe it waits to see which of us will crack, which will make the wrong noise at the wrong time. For now, we have a roof, wood over glass, radios that work, and a plan. Stay quiet, ration supplies, keep watch, and hope the rescue team shows up in those 2 days. I can't say how long I'll sleep on a cot in a room filled with nervous men. Trust has been burned away here, replaced by a cold calculus. Who do you bring with you when the mountain comes down? Drake and David are the only two I'll let within arm's reach at night, yet even that feels like a risk. It's not a normal situation anymore. None of this is normal. Everyone says that, but we learn it in different ways, by seeing the shape at the edge of the light, by tasting blood in the hallway, by watching a friend become something else. We lock doors, we keep our guns within reach, and we wait, each of us alone in our own small room, gripping whatever we can to keep the darkness at bay. Day 41. The day passed with an eerie kind of peace, the kind that feels like the calm before a storm. Nothing happened. No noises, no movement beyond walls. Every 10 minutes, one of us would lean toward the slits in the plywood to scan the horizon. Always the same view, endless white, stretching outward until the mountains rose like broken teeth far in the distance. Without the hard drive full of movies to distract us, we were left with only ourselves. To my surprise, it wasn't half bad. We traded stories, laughed quietly, even shared political views like we were old college roommates stuck in a snowstorm. For the first time in what felt like months, I allowed myself to see David and Drake as more than just survivors at my side. When we make it out of here, I'd be proud to call them my friends. Strange how, in the midst of terror, bonds can be forged stronger than steel. Day 42. This morning brought both relief and dread. The good news came first. A call crackled through the radio. The rescue team had departed and was due to reach us early tomorrow morning. Our spirits soared higher than they had in weeks. We celebrated with weak smiles and tight embraces, letting ourselves taste hope like it was the rarest of meals. But hope has sharp edges. By afternoon, David spotted it, the shape, standing on the horizon like a dark smudge against the endless white. He swore it was still distant, but that didn't comfort any of us.
We knew better now. It didn't matter how far it seemed. If it wanted us, it could cross that ground in no time. I can't shake the thought that we humiliated it by escaping the camp, that we proved ourselves prey clever enough to slip its claws. Predators don't forgive insult. They don't let their meals walk away. I keep trying to tell myself that help is on the way, that all we need is one more night, one more dawn. But every time the wind rattles the plywood, I imagine it tearing the door from its hinges like paper. I know I should think positive. Instead, all I can do is admit the truth. I'm terrified. I'm not ready to die. Day 42, Part 2. It's close to midnight now. David is on watch while Drake and I try to rest. I just finished my shift at the window, and I can't shake what I saw. The shape has moved. It's no longer a distant blot on the horizon. Now it looms maybe 300 yards from the station, still as a statue but terrible in its stillness. Moonlight painted its edges in pale silver, outlining a form that was too large, too wrong to belong in our world. For the entire 2 hours I stood guard, I never once looked away. Some primal instinct screamed at me, if you blink, if you glance aside, it will move closer. So I locked eyes, or whatever counted for eyes, with that silhouette. My neck ached, my eyes watered, but I didn't dare break the vigil. And in that silence, my mind betrayed me. I began to wonder, what happens after we die? How could I have lived all these years without really asking that question? Is there heaven and hell? Do we come back as someone else or as something entirely different? Do we just stop?
I chased answers, but every one left me unsatisfied. All I learned is that death doesn't explain itself until you cross its threshold. Maybe I'll live decades before I know the truth. Maybe only hours. There was one more thing, something I almost didn't write down. The shape whispered to me while I stared, not with sound, but with a presence that pressed into my skull. It said that after death we go somewhere warm. And God help me, the thought didn't sound so bad. After weeks of bone-deep cold, the idea of warmth, true warmth, almost felt like mercy. The shape asked if I wanted to come to this place. I didn't answer, but part of me wonders if I should. Day 42, Part 3. When my shift ended, I told David about the shape's promise. I thought he'd understand, maybe even share my curiosity. Instead, his expression tightened with concern. He didn't argue, didn't even respond. He just excused himself and went looking for Drake, leaving me standing alone at the window like a scolded child. It stung more than I'd like to admit. I only wanted to share what I heard, what I felt. I wanted them to know there might be another way, maybe even a better way. And yet the moment David left, the cold returned, pressing against me through the plywood and concrete. The warmth the shape promised lingered in my mind like a dream I couldn't quite shake. I wanted to tell Drake about it too, about the place beyond all this ice, where warmth never dies. Maybe tomorrow. The two of them ended up whispering in the far corner of the room. Even though their voices stayed low, their eyes never left me. If David spoke, Drake stared. If Drake spoke, David stared. They took turns like I might bolt at any second. David looked upset, his jaw clenched tight, his hand hovering protectively over the pistol at his waist. But Drake, though, seemed different, sunken, weary, almost depressed. I couldn't understand why David would be so tense. He should be happy. They both should be. After all, I've been invited to the warm place. When their hushed conversation ended, they returned to me. David's fingers brushed against the pistol grip as if to remind me that it was there. They told me gently, too gently, that I should go lie down. Drake even offered me his own bedroom, as though he wanted me comfortable. I tried explaining again about the warm place, about how we could all go together, but they only exchanged glances and told me it could wait until morning. They said they wanted to hear everything then. So here I am now, sitting on Drake's bed with my laptop balanced across my knees. Sleep is impossible. My thoughts keep circling back to the warm place. The shape promised I'd be taken there soon. I just can't wait to tell them more, to see their faces when they finally understand. They deserve to know. But something odd is happening. From beyond the door, I hear the steady rhythm of hammering, wood against metal. It takes me a moment to realize what they're doing. Securing me in. Trapping me. They don't want me to leave. Maybe they're afraid. But if they keep me in here, how will we all get to the warm place together? Day 43. It's nearly 4 a.m. now, and my body is buzzing with energy. My thoughts won't stop racing. I can't sleep. The idea of the warm place burns in me like fire. I want David and Drake to know. I need them to know. I can't bear the thought of leaving them behind in this cold, rotting world while I'm taken to where it's bright, warm, and endless.
I've started working on a way out. One of the bed's metal legs came loose, and with enough pressure, I've bent it into something like a crowbar. The flat plate on its end should work against the doorframe. If it doesn't, I'll use my weight. Nothing will stop me. They took the pistol I carried in my waist holster earlier, but they overlooked the hidden one. That's the beauty of this jacket. A secret pocket on the inside, just big enough for a weapon. I pulled it out a while ago, checked the clip. 7 bullets, 7 chances. That's more than enough to take both David and Drake with me to the warm place. I feel relief just knowing that. Happiness, even. The shape was right. The warm place isn't only for me. I can bring them. Together, we'll walk into the warmth, away from the bitter chill of this place, away from the waiting. This may be my final entry. Soon I'll break through the door and we'll leave before the so-called rescue team arrives. Rescue is meaningless when the shape has already chosen me. If anyone ever reads this, I hope the shape calls to you too. It promises that no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, everyone goes to the warm place in the end. My wife will be there one day, waiting with open arms, and you will be too. Everyone will. Far away from the locked room, Susan walked the long, sterile hallway she knew by heart. Years of repetition had dulled her movements into routine. Her job at the hospital was neither glamorous nor fulfilling, but it paid the bills. At least she hadn't ended up like her sister, scraping by, forced into choices no one should ever face just to keep a roof overhead. She stopped outside one of the rooms, a key ring heavy at her side. Room 43. John Macready. He had been here for weeks now. Unlike most of the patients, he never spoke, not a word, since the day he'd arrived. And because of that silence,
John had become her favorite. She'd grown tired of the others, patients who whispered filthy things, who made grotesque gestures when her back was turned. John was different, quiet, predictable. Unlocking the door, Susan stepped inside. As always, John sat in the far corner, his gaze flicking toward her before sliding back to the window. He didn't resist when she changed the sheets on his bed, didn't flinch as she moved about the room. He only watched, detached, as though his mind was elsewhere. She tucked in the sheets neatly, fluffed the pillow, and set it at the head of the bed. From her cart, she retrieved a meal tray, its contents pale and uninspired beneath plastic wrap. Setting it on the desk, she slipped a hand into her pocket. From it, she produced a single piece of candy. She placed it, carefully, beside the bottle of water. It was a small token of gratitude, a reward for his silence, for not making her job harder than it already was. But when she looked back at him, seated in the shadowed corner, something in his eyes seemed different, like he was waiting for something.
Susan turned to face John again, half expecting him to look away as he always did. Instead, his eyes were locked on hers. For the briefest moment, she froze, startled by the sudden and direct contact. She managed to smile, polite smile, then shifted toward the door. She still had a list of patients to check on before her shift ended, and if she hurried, she might even be able to leave early, catch a movie, pretend for a few hours that her life was ordinary. That's when she heard it. How much longer do I have to be here? Susan froze mid-step, her body stiff as if the air itself had turned to ice. The voice was soft, hesitant, but unmistakably real. For weeks, John McReady had been silent, unresponsive beyond the occasional flick of his eyes toward the window. She had assumed he simply didn't talk. Some trauma, some psychological break had left him mute. Yet now those words hung in the stale hospital air, fragile and impossible. She turned slowly, searching his face. What was that, John? He hadn't moved from the corner, but his eyes remained fixed on hers, dark and searching. I just wanted to know how much longer I have to stay here. I don't like it. I want to go home. Susan's throat tightened. In all her years working this ward, she had endured plenty. Slurs whispered behind her back, obscene proposals spoken with eerie calm, laughter that echoed long after she left a room, but never this. No one had ever asked to go home. That wasn't the kind of place this was. I really don't know, John, she said carefully, her voice softer than she intended. If you'd like, I can ask your doctor, see what he says about how long you'll need to stay. Does that sound all right? John gave the faintest nod and turned his gaze back to the window as though the conversation had never happened. Susan didn't wait another second. She spun on her heels, locked the door behind her, and pushed her cart down the hallway with brisk, urgent steps. She skipped the other rooms, her mind still replaying his words, his steady eyes. By the time she reached Dr. Carpenter's office, her pulse was hammering in her throat. She rapped on the door with more force than intended. Inside, she heard movement, then the creak of hinges as the door opened. The doctor stood there, thin and pale, a closed book in one hand, his finger marking the page. His brows lifted in faint annoyance that quickly gave way to concern.
Did one of them try to touch you again? Susan shook her head, pointing back down the long corridor toward John's room. It was John. He spoke to me. Carpenter's eyes widened. The book slipped from his hand, thudding to the floor. He glanced both directions down the hallway, scanning for eavesdroppers, then snapped at her in a low hiss. "Get in here, now." Susan obeyed, stepping inside. Carpenter shut the door sharply and locked it. She noticed with unease that his office was in disarray. Papers scattered across the desk, folders half open, notes spilling out like restless secrets. She had only been inside a handful of times before, but it had always been spotless, ordered. Something about the clutter unsettled her more than John's voice had.
"What did he say?" Carpenter demanded, leaning across the desk. "Exactly. Don't leave anything out. It's a miracle he said anything at all." Susan wet her lips, still rattled. "He asked when he could leave. He said he doesn't like it here, that he wants to go home." Carpenter froze mid-movement, his hands resting on a loose stack of papers. His expression shifted into something unreadable, half confusion, half dread. "He wants to go home?" "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what he said." The doctor rose abruptly, pacing to the window, then back to the desk. He let out a long sigh, almost a groan. "This is problematic. The first words he's spoken since admission, and they're proof he remembers nothing. Not a thing. He talks as if he's here by mistake, as if he can just walk away, as if life will be normal again." Susan frowned, her voice firm now. "Doctor, why is John here? He's the only patient I've ever been assigned to without access to records. What aren't you telling me?" Carpenter hesitated, then gestured for her to sit. She did, her hands twisting in her lap. Finally, he spoke, voice low and grave. "John was part of an expedition team in Antarctica. Months ago, something happened out there, something none of them will explain. A rescue team found him and 2 others stranded at a radar station, miles from their camp. When they arrived, John was tied up, locked in a supply closet. The 2 survivors told me he had tried to kill them. They swore restraining him was the only way they survived." "So you think it was, what, cabin fever?" "That was my first thought, I admit. But if that's true, it's the most severe case I've ever seen. His silence, his detachment, his sudden amnesia. There's nothing else I can call it. And yet," he trailed off, eyes narrowing, voice dropping further, "and yet, I'm not convinced that's the whole story." The silence in the office pressed down heavy, leaving Susan with the uneasy certainty that whatever had followed John back from that frozen wasteland, it wasn't done with him yet.
Dr. Carpenter reached for a battered binder on his desk and slid it across to Susan. The man's fingers hesitated as if the object itself carried weight beyond paper and plastic. She took it, felt the cold snap of the cover, and opened to the first page. The neat, cramped handwriting marched across the lines. An expedition journal, she realized. As she skimmed the first few entries, Carpenter drifted to lean against his desk, arms folded, watching her face. After a few minutes, Susan looked up, puzzled. "It's his journal. Where did you get this?" "Those pages were pulled from his laptop," Carpenter said quietly. "One of the 2 men rescued with him brought the files. He said John had been updating it from the field." He rubbed his temple, the motion thin and tired. "I suspected it might shed light on whatever went wrong out there. I wasn't prepared for what I found." Susan flipped through more pages,
eyes skimming dates, locations, the slow unspooling of fear into obsession. The entries grew darker, more frantic, references to weather, machinery, then to a presence, something they called the shape. Her stomach turned as she read lines about shadows, broken equipment, and men behaving in ways she couldn't reconcile with the people she'd seen on the ward. He hesitated, then reached beneath a stack of files and brought out a manila folder scrawled across in jagged handwriting. Warning. What's in here is graphic. He pushed it toward her. The air between them stiffened. Susan opened the folder with the caution of someone bracing for a wound. The first photo slapped the room with winter light. A body sprawled on the snow, limbs splayed at unnatural angles, the flesh a shocking red against white. She had to cover her mouth. Bile rose like a traitor. She turned page after page, images compounding into a catalog of violence. One man cleft nearly in two, as if something had pulled him apart. Another's skull crushed inward. Frozen footprints leading away from a camp like the tracks of animals fleeing some carnage. "Where did you get these?" she whispered, voice raw. "The rescue team brought them back," Carpenter said, his voice low as if not to wake ghosts. "They found the camp empty of living people. The bodies were outside, scattered. I read the journal first and thought perhaps it was the ravings of a traumatized mind, words written from a place of exhaustion and fear. After I saw these photos, I had to reconsider." He rubbed the bridge of his nose, a tired, small gesture. "John writes about the shape. He calls it a physical manifestation of wrongdoings, like guilt, made flesh. He said it tormented them, drove some to madness or suicide. The images, they're not consistent with normal violence. Something else happened out there, something non-human." The office fell quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, leaves drifted from a tree like pale, indifferent confetti. Susan felt unreal, as if the day's ordinary had collapsed into some darker axis. Carpenter tucked the folder back under his arm and stood. He said, "Come with me," and he unlocked the door and motioned her to follow. His steps had the urgency of someone who had read too much and needed to act. They walked down the hospital corridor, passing rooms whose windows sometimes framed a face, sometimes nothing at all. Each doorway offered a potential witness or a blank stare. At John's door, Carpenter paused and looked in. The man sat in his usual corner as if glued to the wall, quiet, remote, his hands folded loosely in his lap. Susan noticed him muttering something under his breath, words too soft to catch through thick glass.
"Whatever's in those pages," Carpenter said slowly, "I feel pity for him. Part of me thinks he made it up, that his mind cracked under stress and he fabricated a monster to explain the awful. The other part," he trailed off, not finishing. He unlocked the door and motioned Susan inside. They stepped in carefully, as if the room might break underfoot. Carpenter's voice dropped to a practiced calm. "John," he said, "Susan told me you spoke to her. Would you tell me what you said?" John's lips moved once more in the same low mutter. At first, Carpenter could barely make out the sound. Then he turned, the movement small and precise, and faced them fully. For the first time in weeks, his eyes seemed present. Carpenter dug a digital recorder from his pocket and flicked it on with professional habit. He wanted the moment documented, the miracle of speech, perhaps the turning point of a case he'd filed in careful medical jargon for months. The red light blinked, a small mechanical heartbeat between them. John swallowed. He hesitated, searching for words. When they came, they were clear enough. softer, steadier than Susan had expected. "Can you, please, close the door?" Carpenter looked puzzled but obliging. "Sure," he said. "Is it letting in a draft?" John lifted a trembling hand and pointed at the open doorway. "The shape is standing outside. It's best that you don't let it in." The recorder caught the words, tiny and brittle. Carpenter's face shifted, concern sharpened by clinical curiosity. "You saw it again?" John nodded minutely. He turned his head toward the window as if the form waited there. His voice sank to a whisper, the cadence of a man naming an old wound. "It stands on the ridge. It watches. It knows everything. It waits." Susan felt the room constrict, air thick, the light too bright. She had been a nurse long enough to know the thin line between mental illness and an honest report of trauma, the places where memory and reality tangled. But something in John's tone gave her a different dread, not the tone of someone imagining monsters, but of someone burdened by a truth too heavy for the living. "What do you mean it knows everything?" Carpenter asked, leaning forward as if the answer might hold the key to treatment. John turned his head, eyes unfocused, and then, with the ghost of a smile that matched no warmth, he said, "It remembers all the mistakes. It remembers them all." The words fell like flakes of frost, small, sharp, impossible to catch. Carpenter swallowed audibly. He tapped the recorder off and looked at Susan with a gravity that erased the clinical distance between them. "I don't know what this is. If it's purely psychological, then we've stumbled into something extreme and dangerous. If there's a kernel of reality in his account, if some external force is involved, then what happened on that expedition might be far worse than we suspected." They left the room quieter than they entered, the click of the door's lock echoing weirdly down the corridor. Outside, a young face peered from a window and then blinked away. Somewhere, water ticked in a sink. Someone turned a page in a magazine. Life carried on, muffled and small. Susan carried the binder back into Carpenter's office and set it gently on his desk. "If there's anything else," she said, voice low, "you will let me know. If he talks again, you'll call me." "Of course," he replied. His eyes lingered on the jammed folder as if it contained a map to a place neither of them wanted to go. As they parted, Susan couldn't shake the sense that the ward had become a margin between worlds, one foot in the safe hum of fluorescent light and routine, the other stepping, unwillingly, into a cold, silent landscape where something remembered and waited.